Good afternoon. That the UK has a productivity problem is not new. What is new is a concerted effort to address it based on independent research and new policy ideas. That is the mission of the New Productivity Institute and of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is a leading partner in the TPI. My name is Adrian Pabst. I'm Deputy Director of NIESR, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's workshop on the economics and politics of productivity. We have a rich program this afternoon, and I'd like to thank all the speakers and discussants for accepting our invitation and all of you for joining us. We're recording this event, and there'll be an opportunity to put questions to all the speakers via the Q&A function. Before outlining the purpose of the workshop and introducing our keynote speaker, let me hand the virtual floor to my colleague Bart van Ark. Bart is Professor of Productivity Studies at the University of Manchester and Managing Director of the Productivity Institute. He'll say a few words about the TPI and its work. Bart, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Adrian. And first of all, thank you and the National Institute and our colleague Andy Westwood for putting this event together. This is the last event in a series of foundational workshops that the Productivity Institute has organized over the past few months. We started back in September 2020, and we felt that in the first couple of months, we wanted to take a step back and look at some of the key issues that we think are really needed to make sort of a next step towards understanding the productivity puzzle, as it is often described in the United Kingdom. The Productivity Institute is a collaboration between 9 academic institutions, including universities in Glasgow, Manchester, where the Institute is headquartered, Cambridge, Sheffield, Warwick, Cardiff, Belfast, King's College in London, and last but not least, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research in London, which is hosting today's event. As I said, this is the last workshop in this foundational series, and we felt it was quite good to have this last one focused on the issue of institutions and governance. From a research perspective, this is a key focus for us in the Productivity Institute. We spent significant time on thinking about investment issues and regional issues with regard to productivity in the UK and measurement issues. But we do believe that a very important part of the productivity puzzle in the United Kingdom needs to be approached from the perspective of how do institutions function and how can we make sure that they work better in order to drive this complex perspective on productivity together. This is important from our research perspective. It's also very important from the perspective of our regional productivity forums. We started 8 regional productivity forums across the nation, and 3 in the devolved nations and 5 across England. And a lot of the institutional problems really have to do with the fragmentation of those institutions between regions. There's a lot of really good work going on in various parts of the country, that a lot of good initiatives that really help to drive productivity forward, but a lot of it is not very well connected and not very well scaled up. So that's one of the issues that we certainly need to discuss. And then finally, there is also the productivity perspective from a broad policy range. There's a lot of policy domains that touch on productivity. There's nothing like a department of productivity in the government. So understanding how these different policy domains can be connected, again, is critical from an institution's perspective. So we're very happy today that we're able to be hosting this event. Excellent turnout. So it's great to have a lot of people on this call and some excellent speakers and a great panel and discussions to listen to. So with that, no further ado, I'm handing back to you, Adrian, and get the seminar going.
Thank you very much indeed, Bart, for a very helpful overview of what the TPI tries to achieve and will be doing over the next 4.5 years or so. The purpose of today's workshop is to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions that we see both in academic research and in policymaking. And one of them relates to the separation of economics from political science. And we often find silos, and those silos then reinforce fragmented decision-making, combined with the persistent problem of over-centralized government and often weak, ineffective institutions, as well as a constant policy churn. We can see this with fiscal policy and constantly changing rules or targets. We can see it with higher education and further education policies that are rarely joined up. We can also see it with large infrastructure projects that are not really connected to all the regions and localities. So what we really find in the UK, I think, at least it's a hypothesis we want to examine, is that decision-making is too centralized spatially and at the same time too fragmented functionally. And those seem to be 2 persistent problems that contribute to weak productivity growth. So this workshop seeks to challenge both existing research and policy on productivity, with a clear focus on institutions that are specific to productivity performance. That could be more political institutions, such as national government, regional government, and local government. We, of course, have devolved administrations in the UK, as well as metro mayors. But what about, for instance, further down in the towns and coastal areas are often left behind by globalization? How do they, how can they catch up? How can these left behind regions be part of COVID recovery and reconstruction? But our focus will also be on some of the more economic institutions, finance, educational institutions, R&D investment, and the dissemination of knowledge. Now, we don't want to separate those. And so the key thing is to think the interaction, the complex interplay between more economic and more political institutions. But we also need to bear in mind questions such as what makes an institution versus an organization or a network? How can we link up macro, meso, and micro level institutions? How can we think of complementarity between investment in human capital, knowledge capital, and organizational capital? And then perhaps most fundamentally, what are the interactions between non-state and non-market institutions, those which are often left out by more mainstream approaches? So there's a lot of questions we want to focus on, but I want to just finish the introduction with two key questions. What policies can be designed that can address our productivity problem? And how can those policies be better coordinated with one another? And then also, which institutional reforms are necessary for that better policy design, coordination, implementation to take place? I think that's really the focus of our reflections here this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, and it's a real honor and pleasure to introduce to you Professor Sir Tim Besley, who will deliver the keynote presentation in a minute. Tim is School Professor of Economics and Political Science and W. Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics in the Department of Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a member of the National Infrastructure Commission, and in 2018, he was the president of the Econometric Society. His research, which is mostly focused on policy, is in the areas of development economics, public economics, and political economy. There are few, if any, better speakers in the UK to talk about how politics, political science, and economics need to work together to tackle the productivity problem. Among his many distinguished publications are papers in the American Economic Review and the American Political Science Review, and of course, books such as his 2011 tome, Pillars of Prosperity, The Political Economics of Development Clusters. His keynote presentation is entitled Institutions and Productivity, Details That Matter. And as I said, it's a huge pleasure and honor to welcome him. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for that very nice introduction. And thanks also to Bob for giving us the overview of what the agenda is of the Productivity Institute. And I'll try and, as best I can, stay on message in terms of the agenda that you've laid down. I'm kind of trying to speak at the intersection between being an academic, which is of course what is my main day job, and having had a certain amount of experience, particularly in recent years, with the National Infrastructure Commission, but before that with the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, and actually very recently in setting up the new UK Infrastructure Bank. So let me see if I can get that. Yeah. So what I'm going to try and do today is to try and bridge academic and real world experience. I should stress I'm speaking entirely in a personal capacity, not on behalf of the National Infrastructure Commission, although I don't think I'm going to say anything that is at variance with discussions that we've had, because I want to use that to illustrate some of the details that matter, which is the main theme. And for those of you unfamiliar with this, I'll say a bit more about it later. The National Infrastructure Commission was set up in part as a response to the LSE Growth Commission's recommendations in 2012. And after a short while, it was announced by George Osborne, citing actually the work of the Growth Commission as part of the motivation doing that. I'll talk about why we advocated it on the Growth Commission and where I think all of this fits together. But I want to begin with a sort of academic theme, which is a theme, I suppose, that when I teach political economy to my students is sort of why I justify that we want to do that. And that's because traditionally economists have spent a lot of time thinking about market failure, but perhaps as only relatively recently have been thinking about government failure. Of course, within economics, there have been, in particularly the public choice school, a tradition of looking at that, but it's only become mainstream relatively recently. Excuse me. So when we do that, what do we mean by government failure? Well, one way into this is to say, well, we'll look at market outcomes. That's what economists do. And we'll then think about the ways in which government can improve on the market and develop some kind of normative criterion. And that's often in practical terms, at least for infrastructure, but broadly, it's the way it works for a wide range of policies. We think of a normative criterion and we think of a cost-benefit analysis associated with government intervention. Then we use that as a benchmark with which to compare the actual outcome. So there'll be some outcome that occurs in the real world. And then we'll think about ways in which we can design institutions to improve the policymaking framework, supplementing what you might call the core democratic institutions. So, we accept, at least in the democratic world, that we're going to be largely governed by elections, that we're subscribing to broad principles like the rule of law enforced by independent judiciary, and that there's a parliamentary process at the heart of our policymaking. So we kind of accept the core the core principles of democratic governance, but then the question is, how do we go beyond that and what kinds of institutions we might advocate and for what reasons? And for that, one way to think about that is in terms of the diagnostic of the political failures that can occur even with standard democratic institutions. And there are a whole variety of those that we've analyzed in the academic literature. Some will be familiar to many of you. Problems of short-termism, because democratic governance is defined over electoral cycle. The ability to commit beyond the electoral cycle is not easy. There are problems that have been studied of time inconsistency, that governments often will reverse decisions that they would like to commit to ex ante. There are perils of majoritarianism in terms of what the political process can evaluate at any point in time, when there's still going to be, in practice, at election time, limited issue salience. And then there's a whole catalogue of failures of political accountability. Again, some of those have to do with multi-issue politics. What exactly are we holding government to account on? Maybe lack of political competitiveness. This is a particular issue in local governance, where very often we have a single party that's in control of a local government and very little political competition. There are issues around the ignorance of those who are in the end being asked to make the decision about who governs, lack of information, and voter ignorance. And finally, there are issues perhaps have entered political economy analysis much more recently around behavioral biases. So as behavioral economics has taken off inside economics, we're now applying more and more those ideas to political economy to think of reasons why accountability could fail on account of behavioral biases among voters and other actors within the political system. So there's a whole kind of catalogue of sources of political failure. Why the cost-benefit test, which might be our kind of touchstone for good economic policy, isn't necessarily satisfied even with the core democratic institutions that we might advocate. So there's already kind of a tradition of responding to political failure by creating more independent institutions that are somewhat removed from the standard day-to-day political process. And areas where I would say it's broadly accepted are central banking, independent regulators, competition authorities. I put question marks after the next two, but I think we're getting close to these being part of the broadly accepted fiscal councils that have an oversight role in terms of fiscal forecasting and perhaps an eye on the government budget constraint. Scientific advice is an interesting one. I've also put a question mark because, of course, it's been very salient during the pandemic, just what the status is of scientific advice. but most people accept that broadly independent scientific advice in Britain, that's been in the form of SAGE, as you know, is again broadly accepted. But there are many areas which are still being debated, and I think are germane to the work the Productivity Institute is doing. At least some of them are. One is allocating medical resources. We have the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Again, I probably maybe just creep that one above the line now, that most people accept independent decision making. Development banks, where we have an interesting experiment about to unfold in the UK over the next months and years, having created the UK Infrastructure Bank. Infrastructure authorities, which is what I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment. There are advocates of planning or productivity commissions. These are used in other countries. Australia is a notable example, which grew out of I think the Trade Commission originally, is now an accepted institution that provides independent input into economic policy making in Australia. And there probably are variants, for example, in the Netherlands and other places of that. And then industrial strategy bodies would be another example, although the UK, as I'll talk about later, has decided at the moment that it wants a different approach than the one it was, the path it was on. Now, in relation to all of this, the theme that I want to hit, and this is kind of the theme that's my policymaking hat on, reflecting on the academics approaches. The academic approaches tend to be quite broad brush. They tend to try and think about what's true on average, but they're much less good, at least the kind of analysis done by economists, at thinking about a number of the details. I think there's a kind of, some of these areas are now kind of becoming big research topics, but historically, in the way we thought about institutions, they've been quite broad brush in the treatment that's occurred. Now, one of them, of course, is the relationship with politics. If you're like me, believe that ultimately the goal of democratic politics is to create a strong bond between elected representatives and their citizens, then one cannot get away from thinking how politics works within that context. And I'm going to return to that when I reflect on some of what the National Infrastructure Commission has been doing. But that is, again, a lot of details really matter. To call an institution independent doesn't help at all, because any independent institution that has the sovereign authority of government has to interact with the political process, and the way that happens, the details I'm going to claim really, really matter. Another detail that really matters is personnel. How do you select people, and what do you try to represent within an institution? It goes a little bit to does one in the UK right now want to design institutions that are representative of devolved administrations? Are there competing interests that need to be reconciled in institution design? Or is that not an important consideration? It's not, for example, a route we've gone down with the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. We have not got devolved nation representation on that. And I think that was a decision that was made very early on. The details around incentives and accountability are absolutely key. And one theme that I'm going to come back to again in a later slide is the sources of competence. I mean, I think independent institutions work when they are given the capacity to engage in competent policy analysis and policy advocacy within the context of a political framework. And how you create that competency is a detail that really matters. The thing I was struck by when I joined the Monetary Policy Committee, for example, was just how much of the investment that had gone in the era of the independence of the Bank of England to making it a truly authoritative commentator on the economic outlook. And a lot of the authority of the Bank of England rested on its competence for doing that, as much as it rested on its policy independence, I would claim. Another theme, and again, I'm going to come back to this, is rules versus norms. The sort of first generation literature on institutions within economics was much more about rules or formal institutions than it was about norms or informal institutions. I think that's really shifting and understanding that the acquired and evolved modus operandi of an independent institution has as much to do with norms as it does with the rules. Let me again come back to the Monetary Policy Committee as an example. Almost all the procedures that the Monetary Policy Committee uses leading up to an interest rate decision, I would regard as to be part of the informal or norm-driven structure. They're not part of the formal rules that were laid down by Parliament or anyone else. These are things that evolve, but they're absolutely critical to making an institution work. And if we spend too much time thinking about rules rather than norms, we rather miss the point. And related to that are what I would call the soft versus the formal powers. At the end of the day, what makes an institution authoritative rests not just on what formal power it has, but the way it can use its influence. And that's going to very much rest on an evolving set of norms and its competence in relation to the issues that it deals with. So let me come back to the National Infrastructure Commission, which I'm now going to use as a kind of example to illustrate some of these themes. Why did the National Infrastructure Commission get set up? Well, ultimately, the LSE Growth Commission, which advocated a National Infrastructure Commission, did it largely based on a belief that the UK had an investment problem, not just in infrastructure, but in areas like innovation, capital formation, and skills. That'll be familiar since these are the issues even 10 years on from us convening the LSE Growth Commission are the very central issues that I know the Productivity Institute is still grappling with. These are not solved issues. We kind of took academic input and specialist evidence sessions to try and come up with some proposals. And one of our proposals was a National Infrastructure Commission. What did we diagnose as the political failures that was trying to respond to? Well, one of them was political instability, the lack of long-term thinking. I was very struck we had a series of events at LSE at one point where we interviewed former chancellors of the Exchequer. And I did Nigel Lawson and Alistair Darling were the two that I was asked to interview. And I remember interviewing Alistair, and we talked about infrastructure. This was actually predates, I think, the Growth Commission. But one thing he said was when he was Minister of Transport, Secretary of State for Transport, I think he'd been responsible for going and cutting the ribbon on the M6 toll, which runs north of Birmingham. And he remarked that in his speech before he cut the ribbon, he said, I'm very pleased to open this. Harold Wilson would have been delighted because it turned out that the M6 toll had been proposed under Harold Wilson, but it was the Blair government that actually cut the ribbon on that project. And that was a classic example of how the political process on occasions has found it hard to create stable long-term policy thinking. Lack of a clear appraisal criteria. Now, of course, the Treasury has its green book, and that's very important, but we're talking about stepping outside of that narrower framework and thinking about what it takes to create transformational change, not incremental change. And often there's lack of transparency in the criteria used, and obviously having a good handle on economic costs and benefits, for that matter, is important if you're not going to have a problem of underinvestment. So we advocated it in principle on the basis that we didn't think the institutional framework, even though we respected that this was a deep part of what we call democratic institutions, was fit for purpose. In the charter where the Infrastructure Commission was set up, its charter roughly says the following: support sustainable economic growth, to improve competitiveness and improve quality of life, and to do so by assessing national infrastructure needs over a long horizon. At the moment, we're thinking towards 2050, but obviously that's going to be a rolling horizon, and monitoring the government's progress in delivering that. And the government, as with other institutions of an independent nature, sets that remit on an ongoing basis. When we originally envisaged, and this is kind of important now, we thought of the Infrastructure Commission. We called it an Independent Planning Commission, which I guess not everyone latched onto that idea and probably was had some sort of vaguely post-Soviet connotation, so perhaps not so surprising. But I think National Infrastructure Commission is a much better term. But we envisaged this as part of an ecosystem, which included, interestingly, an infrastructure bank. And so those of us who were involved from the start are quite delighted that that has now been added. The National Infrastructure Commission, for those who know, is not a delivery body. It's a strategic body. It interacts with a wide range of government departments, regional, local governments, expert bodies, regulators, infrastructure providers. So it's kind of a bit of the center of the whole infrastructure ecosystem. It has 8 commissioners, and we have an expert secretariat. What has it been doing? Well, it has specific reports on particular issues, some of which have been pretty influential. There was the New Deal for the Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Oxford corridor, the rail needs assessment recently for HS2, quite a lot of work on net zero, which is an important topic. So those are the kind of specific reports which are agreed with Treasury as particular commissions. And then once a Parliament, we're asked to produce a national infrastructure assessment. And that's a kind of overall strategic vision of where we think infrastructure investment has to focus over a 30-year time horizon. And we produced the first one of those in 2018, and the government responded to it in 2020 with its national infrastructure strategy. So that's kind of a brief history of where we are now, of how we got to where we are now. I want to spend the rest of the time, though, coming back to some of those details that matter and reflecting on some of the practical lessons. Because for me, as someone who, first of all, was involved in the Growth Commission, then I was asked to be part of the Infrastructure Commission right at the start. It's been kind of interesting seeing institution building from the inside and watching that, what I regard as an essentially evolutionary process taking place. And is still taking place. I think that's the thing about an institution of any kind, that it takes a while for its purpose and its modus operandi to become clear. And getting that right is important, but it can't be pre-planned. And I think it's very dangerous to go into any process of trying to build an institution that is effective, that you just say, here's my plan, and now I'm going to execute it. I think these things are inherently reflexive processes. And that's because the norms matter for me just as much as the rules. So the first thing we did on the Infrastructure Commission was to try and work out how we were going to operate as a collective, as a group of commissioners. What was going to be the focus of our meetings? How were we going to do that? And that's evolved quite a bit. We've had 2 chairs over the period of the Infrastructure Commission with somewhat different styles. And I think we've settled into a particular approach. Now, whether that's an optimal approach, I wouldn't know, but it's certainly something that's got as much to do with the norms as the rules as they were ever laid down by anyone. Why has the Infrastructure Commission been effective where it has? I think enormous amount of authority comes from convening power. So let me just take one example, and somebody, I think it was Bob, referred to fragmentation in his presentation. So when we did one of our very early reports, which was on the Oxford, Milton Keynes, Cambridge corridor, we convened a series of meetings, which involved something like, there were 32 different governmental bodies, local councils, local enterprise partnerships, all manner of bodies that had in principle some interest in that corridor. And what did we do? We brought them together and we had a series of meetings. And the interesting thing at the beginning of those meetings, everybody, not everyone, but almost everyone in the room said the most remarkable thing about this meeting is we've never met anybody else in the room, or we've met very few people in the room. You're bringing together a group of people who hadn't ordinarily tried to collaborate. Now that seems like an incredibly trivial thing to do, but it's a detail that matters, to echo my theme. Using the convening power of an institution to create a conversation, to try and use that as a basis for improving the quality of policy debate should not be underestimated. But you won't find that in any of the textbooks around how do you link institutions to productivity, but I wouldn't underestimate its importance, at least to us. It may not be that that's portable knowledge, but it's certainly something that mattered to us. Another thing was that I think when you set up a new institution, quick wins really matter. So we were handed 3 projects. We weren't handed other projects. So we weren't, for example, handed Heathrow, and we weren't initially handed HS2. So we were able to look within relatively less controversial territory for projects where we could stamp our mark on the area. And obviously a lot mattered on the initial reception of those projects. But we were fortunate in having projects where they were incredibly well received. So one of our initial projects was the Oxford Milton Keynes Cambridge corridor, which was well received, but also a project on interconnectors for energy, which again, very specific, but it was well received. We were playing into a policy domain where there was a real readiness for a new and substantive approach. So those quick wins really matter in generating institutional effectiveness. Something else that really matters is the accumulation of expertise. So over time, you really do become, if you're operating well, the go-to place for certain kinds of policy discussion and debate. And the Infrastructure Commission worked hard on that. I think we've got some way to go. One area that we are going to build more capacity in is data. If you're the place where everybody who wants data on that topic logs onto your website, even if the data isn't data you've particularly collated and collected yourself, that becomes associated with being authoritative and having expertise. So simple things like having a website that is a go-to place gives a strong sense that you're the place that is the locus of expertise in an area. Access to the media is important. I think that's where independence matters, but you have to play that carefully within the politics. That's where being sensitive to the politics is important, but having independent access to the media, I would argue, is an extremely important feature of being a genuinely workable independent institution. Thinking the unthinkable, I put a question mark on this one. I think independent institutions are a good place where, in principle, thinking the unthinkable is a good idea. So a particularly difficult area, I would say, that the Infrastructure Commission at some point will probably have to encounter more than it has so far is road pricing. Road pricing is an extremely politically sensitive issue. I'd say it's unfinished business in the current policy agenda. We will have to confront it as we lose tax revenue from petrol-driven vehicles. There's going to have to be replacement of those revenues, so it will play into a very difficult fiscal situation. Of course, the Infrastructure Commission is not an authority on fiscal policy, nor should it become one. But I think that's just an example of an area where though some kind of very independent thinking is needed and will probably be helpful to politics, not unhelpful to politics if it's structured in the right way. Something else that I think is important is to establish early on that there are no magic bullets. One thing that I think that we've done well on the Infrastructure Commission is not to claim more for what infrastructure can deliver than it really can, in the sense that infrastructure is really one piece, and sometimes a quite limited piece of what you need to make economic progress in a particular place or context. And you can't and I think the same was true with monetary policy. You have to learn the limitations of the instruments you have available to them and be completely honest about the limits of those instruments, and not to overclaim that your role is more important than it is. And there's a kind of thin line between overclaiming and underclaiming. You don't want to claim that you're irrelevant. I don't think there's a danger of that in the context of infrastructure, given the net zero challenge and the leveling up challenge. But you have to find that middle ground between somehow pretending that you've got some magic bullet. And then the other thing, and I think this is really important in evolving competence, is that success really breeds success. Once you're viewed as having delivered at least something authoritative, that gives you a lot of leverage. You can recruit better staff. That would be a very tangible consequence of being seen to be a successful organization. That you can persuade people because they know if they come and work for this organization, they will have an opportunity to be part of an influential, policy-oriented body. And that's important because at the end of the day, I think public servants are essentially motivated people. They want to be part of something that makes a difference. So these are just some very granular, practical lessons that I wanted to draw out, partly because none of this, or almost none of this, is in what I would say the conventional textbook treatment of the political economy of institutions, at least not the manual or the literature of the economists. Maybe other fields, the public administration people or elsewhere, might have had more wisdom on this, but these are things that I think I've learned as very practical lessons from being involved in setting up a new institution and trying to make it functional along with some very committed colleagues. Now, the question is where next, and that this is open territory and probably will be a fair bit of debate in today's seminar. We've already announced a UK infrastructure bank, and as we speak, there is a process going on both to select some of the key personnel and then to define the agenda. Quite rightly, there are many open components of this still, because that evolutionary process, the one I described, that the Infrastructure Commission has been through, will be necessary, I believe, in the context of the Infrastructure Bank. And getting good people in there as part of the organization, part of their initial role will be to make this organization work. And one doesn't want to lay down a blueprint that's too inflexible, I would say. Now, of course, the Industrial Strategy Council was just abolished for whatever reasons. Kwasi Kwarteng decided that it was not part of what the current government strategy would be. So quite what is going to happen, I noticed on the most recent publication of the Industrial Strategy Council, one of its swan song publications, it advocated some kind of independent body to take its place to be a kind of wider thinking body on the issue of growth in the UK. There are areas where the role of independent institutions is still being debated. Housing would be an example. Skills would be another. We don't have any kind of really integrated skills strategy, I would claim, in the UK. Maybe it could be done within the context of a more independent approach, looking out, as I say, to 2040, 2050, whatever be a horizon over which we really need to evolve that strategy. Now, I think, again, something Bart mentioned in his opening remarks, there's a danger here of fragmentation. Do we really want all of these functionally separate institutions running around? However, are we going to bring the agendas together? Because it's absolutely critical that infrastructure works with skills, works with housing, works with innovation, works with capital formation, to have any chance of really changing the economic outlook for the UK. And that's a real work in progress. You might be able to create very functionally competent institutions, but you've absolutely no guarantee. And one topic I didn't talk about, I could even have talked about it for the whole of this presentation, is how this might play particularly into devolved structures. Are the devolved governments going to be the place? And I don't mean the devolved national governments, and also the role for devolved regional governments in the UK in doing that joining up and interacting with functionally competent bodies. And actually, the National Infrastructure Commission has done a lot of work. We have a current towns project, for example, where we've been working with a range of towns. We've had a cities project. We work with the regional mayors, trying to join up what we do with some of their wider strategies, because obviously we can't be across the piece doing all of the things that are the priorities of those devolved governments. Interestingly, we're not, we have a strange relation with the officially devolved administrations. So a topic like energy is a UK-wide topic, whereas a topic like transportation is devolved. So we sort of sit a little bit between a fully national and a fully devolved strategy. Okay, so I'm nearly at an end, so then we can open it up to Q&A. So there's kind of the way I got into this, and I think for me it's still robust and correct that we think this way, is that there are ways of fixing government by thinking about changes in the institutional framework to supplement the core institutions of democratic governance and accountability, and working with them, not viewing it as outsourcing in some non-democratic way, but trying to make the political process itself work better. That has to be the right way to think about this, because it has to work with democratic politics. But when you're doing that, partly because of that, the details of the structures really matter. But the nice thing, I think, and one of the reasons why you can be successful, and I would say the National Institutes for Health and Care Excellence is an example, you kind of can cut across the ideological space. This is not something that any one government of any particular variety should find useful or not useful. If you're a competent body, I think you can very much be part of the long-term institutionalization of good policy making. And I think if it's well designed, you can cut across all of those what can be unhelpful ideological predispositions around how to do things. And I think that's very, very powerful. The approach that's going to work has got to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. Of course, one trumpets the setting up of any new institution after one's decided to do it. But a lot of the hard yards are really after the institution has been announced and even come into being, taking that evolutionary path to make it effective, particularly worrying about the norms, the creation of competence, the issues I referred to. So my sort of take home is that academic thinking has explored the right issues, particularly around the need to supplement politics with expert and independent decision making, but it's perhaps not been as good at thinking through the details of implementation and operation. Of course, that's very case specific. And that's why I've chosen today to focus on a very concrete example of an institution I happen to have been involved in. So you can't write the blueprint that's going to be in any way overarching or universal. I think there is a tendency in economics, perhaps less so in other disciplines, to think that averages matter more than they do. So a good example would be the literature on central bank independence. Very often it's asked the question, is there on average an impact on inflation or unemployment of having a more independent central bank, however you choose to categorize that? Looking at that average effect, I would argue, is not very useful when it comes to thinking about actually delivering on some form of central bank independence, because the details matter far more than any average relationship you might find in the data. Now, of course, at the other extreme, you get to sort of what I would call detailed historical analysis. And I'm always in awe of historians who plow through the archives and tell you, you know, what Churchill had for breakfast or whatever, as if that was significant to understanding government policy at the time. Some details matter, some perhaps matter less. And it's a case of picking through the details that matter and the details that are interesting to know, but not super important for that. And that's a real art, to figure out how you come to a judgment about the details that matter and the details that don't. And I think the more academics can get involved in the detail of policy making, I think that can be a really important cross-fertilization of thinking on these type of issues. So with that, I will cease and throw open to questions.
Tim, thank you ever so much for such a rich presentation, full of insights and really setting the scene wonderfully for our discussions this afternoon. We've had a number of questions via Q&A, and let me just put them to you maybe in groups of 3, if that's okay. And then some of those answers may then, in fact, touch on more than one question. So the first question is from Natalie Bennett, who sits in the House of Lords for the Green Party, and she's asking about independent institutions. She says, you don't mention the possibility of people's assemblies as a way of addressing virtually any issue, for example, climate assembly. So an alternative development of participatory democracy. How would that fit into your view of institutions? And then that's also linked to the highly concentrated nature of political power in the UK, on which you've touched. Jonathan Haskell is asking, is there a lesson from not being handed Heathrow? He's asking, did that reflect your position in the ecosystem or the fact that you were new? Would it have been better had it been dealt with by the Infrastructure Commission? And our colleague Arnab Bhattacharjee from Heriot-Watt University is saying, great presentation, Tim, thank you very much. This is somewhat tangential to your main focus on the institutional political structure, but infrastructure placement is an important issue, also political. How do you decide on that in a way that maximizes not only direct, but also spatially and spatial indirect effects? And does it create best opportunities for creating alternative centralities? So quite pertinent also for the levelling up agenda. Where can we find more about the National Infrastructure Commission's thinking on these matters? So those 3 perhaps to start with, Tim.
Those are three great questions. On the first question on participatory democracy, my broad answer is, again, I perfectly would embrace that, and I'll give an example in a minute. But again, I'd say the details really matter. I mean, exactly where and how you feed this in, how you set the agenda for that process matters. So I think advocating participatory democracy as if that tells us what we are actually wanting to do doesn't actually help that much until you drill down. So here's the example. The Infrastructure Commission did spend some time looking at using citizens' juries to look at concerns around the reform of transportation, in particular congestion issues and how you deal with congestion issues. And one of the insights, again, and I'll be honest with you, I was something of a skeptic about that. That just suggests that I'm some sort of superior academic. I don't know, but it was actually a very interesting process, and I learned far more than I thought I would learn by convening groups of citizens, and so it sort of speaks to the question. And one thing that came out of that was people were very willing, for example, to pay higher congestion pricing if that was used to fund better public transport. So there was a kind of key quid pro quo that came out of that. Now, that may be well understood by policymakers, but in fact, when we trialed some of these ideas and said, where's the evidence base for a proposition like that, it was surprising how little evidence there was out there. And so that was something that I learned. I mean, it's a very small thing to learn, that people want to join up policies. It's no good perhaps just doing that, but that's a very small lesson from participatory democracy. How you institutionalize it and how you then frame its role in relation to decision making. I would personally be skeptical. Earlier in my career, I studied initiatives and referenda, which are widely used in the US for supplementing using state level democracy in the US. And it's very clear that if you do this by local referenda or allowing citizens even to place initiatives on the ballot, that often actually leads to bigger policy distortions than you would get through normal channels. So there's some real, again, it's a details that matter thing. Are there certain issues you would want to do this on, some issues you don't want to do it on? But I'm completely open to it being a part of the landscape. But again, the details matter. I mean, not being handed Heathrow. I think in general, I won't talk about Heathrow specifically. What you don't want, I mean, in rugby, there's a notion of a hospital pass, for those of you who know what that means. Essentially, for those of you like me, at least the men on the call, will remember being on a rugby field against your will when you were sort of 11 years old, and I was quite small, so the hospital pass really means something to me. Namely, if someone gave you the ball, you'd suddenly find 3 6-foot guys bearing down on you, crushing you because you were on the ball. And that notion of making sure that you, at least in an early stages of any project, can get those quick wins. Now, I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened in the case of Heathrow. Maybe the analysis that could have come out of that would have been different. At the time we were the Infrastructure Commission was created, the Davis report had happened relatively recently, so there was a notion that was settled. It wasn't done for strategic reasons. But if I look back and think, yeah, we were much better to bed our activities in on a relatively less politically controversial territory. Now I'd feel a lot more confident if suddenly government turned around now and said Heathrow's in your portfolio. I think we're in a much better place because we've progressed as an institution. On the question of infrastructure placement, this is really interesting. It's kind of, it gets to the issue of what is a strategic issue and what is a sort of more operational issue. And you have to draw the line somewhere on that. At the end of the day, deciding how to allocate a transportation budget across space is irreducibly political in the nature of that judgment. Because if someone gets more, almost certainly someone else has to get less. And I personally would have a problem with thinking that purely expert judgment, as might come out of an independent body, would be able to turn this into an issue where uncontroversially it's an issue that if you like, science can resolve. I mean, if you're asking me where to build a road junction, maybe I'd think that the cost-benefit analysis was sufficiently competent that it might give me a decent guide to that. But when you're really trying to do something ambitious, really transformative, I just don't think the numbers or any other scientific basis for that decision are going to be sufficiently precise that this can be turned into something that an independent body could say, this is a matter of science and you better do it. And actually, we have a very good example of that in the pandemic. Everybody kept saying, well, why isn't somebody doing the sort of trade-offs between lives and livelihoods when we choose government policy in a pandemic? I think there's a very good reason. That's too hard. Nobody really knows how to do that calculation. And if you do it badly, you're just making the situation worse. You're not doing it well. And we had pretty much no idea about the nature of that trade-off. And for someone to stand up and pretend that they could redesign policy to be at a better point on the trade-off between lives and livelihoods was probably just doing it shooting from the hip. And when we as experts or academics do things on that basis, we undermine our credibility in the end. We don't enhance it. So I think, again, it's part, know where your limitations are and don't weigh in on a topic and pretend it can be resolved as a kind of scientific matter, when at the end of the day, the politicians that we elect have to put their hands up and make those type of tough decisions.
Tim, thank you very much. I will turn to some more questions in the Q&A function that we've received from all the participants, and thank you very much for your excellent question. So one is from Harry Thompson, who's the economic policy lead at the Institute of Welsh Affairs, and he's asking, should Wales consider establishing an independent body, for example, an economic development agency, given that it's already decided to set up a development bank and a national infrastructure commission for Wales? So it doesn't make sense to add to those independent organizations in the case of Wales. Another question from Jen Nels is, with respect to productivity, do you recommend a replacement for the Industrial Strategy Council? And if so, what kind of changes would you advocate in its focus or structure? And from Hector Calvo-Pardo, isn't political and ideological capture concern for any new institution, particularly for those with high potential voting returns? So what sort of safeguards have been built in to avoid this possibility with the UK infrastructure bank that's now being set up? So they're the next three questions, Tim.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief so we can get another round in. I think the question on Wales is very, very interesting. In some respects, it overlaps with the sort of what next Industrial Strategy Council. I mean, is that a productivity group? I can't remember, you had a different term for that, but a sort of wider ranging economic policy council. And I think the answer is, in principle, all of these things can be created and made to work. I think one thing that we need to, I'll step back a little bit from the specific question and just raise a challenge, which is, as we, quite rightly, we have a lot of competence now in our devolved nations. But the risk is that we're not joining up the debates in the devolved nations sufficiently well with some of the stuff that's going on in other places. So we can't fragment too much in that respect. And we have had a conversation going with the Welsh Infrastructure Commission. I think there's a Scottish one now as well. They all have slightly different remits and different functions to the one we're doing. But I think more thinking has to be done about how you join together these institutions. You may still want an independent one for Wales. Now, coming back to the question on what next. I mean, I'm somewhat sympathetic that there should be something like a productivity council, productivity commission. I know David Vines is on the call. He's been arguing this based particularly on the Australian model. I think that there's a compelling case for that to be part of what we discuss and debate. And I guess Wales could have a version of this, but I wouldn't want to do it without a really clear idea of what exactly is, to use my term, the political failure that this body is trying to address, and how is it going to be given the instruments to address it. So I'm completely open. And I think the Industrial Strategy Council sort of had elements of that. And there was a notion of what the problem was, that we needed more coordinated action. But I don't think it ever quite, and I'm certainly not part of the advocacy for abolishing it at all. But it's really essential that we have, whatever body we have, has to have a very clearly defined mandate, which is broad enough also to encompass the goals that it has set for it. And I'm somewhat agnostic. I'm very happy to be in a room and debate and listen to alternatives. But as I said earlier, the details would matter. And so whether I'd be persuaded or not would be down to really very detailed elements of this. And in terms of sort of politics and ideological capture, I mean, this is forever a risk in any domain. And that's why developing competence for an institution becomes so important. there is always a line at which, if you're part of an independent body, you have the capacity, if you are independent, to speak out on certain issues which you are concerned are crossing some kind of line, where you feel that your core mandate is to some extent compromised by constraints imposed by the political framework. But it's a very again, there's no way of writing the rule book here. It's a very tricky moment to know at what point would you say, we as a body are dissatisfied for either reasons we feel we're being lent on or whatever it might be. And the infrastructure bank will have to find its way through this. Of course, it's a highly politically charged activity, giving out loans at 60 basis points or whatever it would be above the government borrowing rate. This is going to be a politically contentious area, but it has to be the case that that the bank finds its own institutional framework, the details that matter, to find its way through it. Otherwise, it won't be a success. So I agree with the challenge. I don't think it's insurmountable. I think good, well-designed institution with the right kind of personnel can for sure make that work.
Tim, thank you very much. We've got a few more minutes, so I will take a final round of 3 questions. One set of questions is from Jesse Norman from the Spinoza program. So I don't think it's Jesse Norman in the Treasury. He's asking, can you say a little bit about what are your takeaways in terms of revision of current intellectual conventional wisdom in political economy, whether the National Infrastructure Commission could itself be held more accountable, and how we assess the bearings of your conclusions for productivity. So that's a set of 3 questions. Maybe you take the ones you want to answer, Tim. Then from Nick Alton, what about vested interests? HS2 is one example he mentions, and the other one is broadband and BT's open reach vested interest. And then finally from George Perendia, as much as an inclusive multilateral development measure have been suggested to supplement core single dimensional GDP, what measures can then one use in measuring productivity in that context? So the final set of 3 questions. And again,
three great questions. I'm not going to do full justice to. I'll answer particularly the takeaways. I mean, for those of us who've kind of spent the last 15 or however many years, maybe even 20 years of our lives worrying about political institutions and their role, and this was already the drift of thinking, and people like Guido, who's on the call, were at the forefront of this. I mean, bringing a better understanding of the role of norms and culture into our understanding of institutions is something that we're kind of trying to do. It's much, much harder than a kind of rule-driven approach. And there are many people out there, anthropologists and others, who have been working in this space trying to think about it. I don't think we're there yet. And I'm not saying there's a kind of single approach that we can bring to bear on our understanding of institutions that will be the answer to that. But that is a critical piece of what we need to have a better academic understanding of how institutions work. I have no doubt is true. And I've come to that view as much from my experience of being part of different policymaking institutions as I have from thinking that it's an important intellectual challenge in its own right. On the vested interests, I mean, a part of the reason I have independent advice is to try and cut through them, but there's only so much that I think can be debunked scientifically, meaning, of course, where you see people making claims that you think are counterfactual claims about something as an independent institution, and often there's a famous quote from Keynes that I can't remember about ideas being everyone's a prisoner of bad ideas, or whatever the exact quote said. But the point is, you have to debunk ideas, and there's a kind of responsibility for any commission. That is a way of trying to try and combat vested interests. But there are sometimes cases where it's clear that the commitment to that project is simply not going to be something that is amenable to purely scientific analysis. From an earlier, I won't mention HS2, but there's one of the very interesting discussions I had early on in the Infrastructure Commission was when Michael Heseltine was a commissioner. And Michael had been a big advocate of Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf was a very interesting project because at the time, a lot of people were deeply skeptical about the idea you could persuade the City of London to recreate itself on a brownfield site only a couple of miles to the east of its current location. And so when that started off, it failed, I'm told, most of the cost-benefit analysis anyone ever did. And yet the politicians drove that project forward. And Michael, I think, was involved in that as one of the politicians who did that. What's interesting is people might say, well, it became a kind of pet project, a vested interest that then politics had to sort of respond to. But in fact, I mean, as we all know now, it's one of the most significant structural and transformational changes in London that we've seen in the last 50 years was the creation of a whole new complex for financial institutions and actually kept the whole financial services industry strong in London. So one person's vested interest is someone else's perspicacious identification of opportunity. And in terms of productivity, I mean, notice that among the mandate, the remit of the Infrastructure Commission is quality of life, which will of course resonate with your project. So what do we mean by quality of life as distinct from productivity? I would say a proper definition of productivity is really something that is about contributing to quality of life. And on the Commission, we've thought quite a bit about how we make that real. What does it mean to build infrastructure that supports quality of life, not just standard economic measures of productivity, which would be very narrowly, do you make this firm more productive, on producing these goods or not. So I think it's a huge challenge how we do that measurement and then how we do it effectively to a point where we can begin to use it as an arbiter for different types of strategies. But let me end with one very specific example on that, which is something as simple as if you ask people who live in various parts of the UK what makes you unhappy, particularly in rural areas, they'll all say, oh, the bus service stops at 6 p.m. And that means I have to get an expensive taxi back from my nightclub, when people used to go to nightclubs, back to home at 2 a.m. in the morning because there's no public transport. Now, that's not adding to productivity in any meaningful sense. But I can tell you it's the kind of thing that makes people in some parts of the UK really unhappy, and they feel their voices are not heard. There's no mechanism almost for getting them the capacity to voice that concern and to get bus services that run till probably not 2 a.m., but at least 10 p.m. So that's, for me, a small example of why that divergence can sometimes be really, really important.
Tim, thank you ever so much for your presentation and also for all the questions you've answered. Really, we couldn't have hoped for a better start to the seminar, and this will be very important for the work as we develop it, and we'd love to involve you more and invite you back to a future one. So thank you ever so much. We'll now move on to session one, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Guido Tabellini. Guido's been Professor of Economics at Bocconi University in Milan since 1994, where he's also served as rector between 2008 and 2012. He's been, among many other things, president of the European Economic Association. Among his numerous publications and ones that have shaped our work is a book co-authored with Torsten Persson entitled Political Economics, Explaining Economic Policy, that was published first by MIT Press in 2000. Guido's public presentation here this afternoon is on the political economics of productivity. It gives me great pleasure to give him the floor. Guido, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been very interesting to listen to the discussion so far. So let me start by outlining how, of course, we think of productivity growth. You can think of it as TFP growth, which is determined by a number of factors: the allocation of labor and capital across firms and across sectors, the effectiveness of public infrastructures, including the quality of public administration, and also the organization of production inside the firm. Then another component of labor productivity is the capital deepening part, how much private investment there is, including knowledge accumulation, and how much human capital accumulation we see. So all of these components of productivity are affected by public policies. These public policies are endogenous, and of course they are also affected directly or indirectly by the prevailing culture. So listening to what Tim was talking about, and in particular the idea of delegations to independent authorities, I was wondering, but why can't we achieve the same goals by having a well-organized, structured, competent minister in charge of development or of education? And of course, these ministers in our democracies have these responsibilities. So one answer to this question, as Tim pointed out, is what are the political failures that may be present inside governments or legislatures, and answering that question can, of course, be one component of understanding whether and how to delegate aspects of these decisions to independent authorities. So the first point I want to discuss is precisely what could be the government failures in the public policies, the political failures in the public policies that matter for productivity growth. And then I want to say a few words about how culture may be important for productivity growth, and here thinking more about perhaps private organizations. I don't want to talk about the UK. I want to think more broadly, so I'll say a few words also about democracies versus autocracies, and I will do this trying to discuss the conceptual issues and the trade-off that we face in thinking about these broad determinants of productivity growth, not specific policies. So the first and most obvious aspect of political failures or policies that matter when thinking about productivity growth are policies that entail intertemporal trade-offs. These could be decisions on public investments, but any reform with that entails an intertemporal trade-off would be relevant for these considerations. So the question that I'm asking here is what kind of political mechanism matter and may lead to government failures when thinking about intertemporal policies. As an Italian, but also as a student of political economics, the key aspect that clearly stands out when thinking about political failures in the domain of intertemporal decisions has to do with the features of the government. If the government is stable, then it will have a longer term horizon, and it will be able to invest and acquire competence and be in control of the bureaucracy. So the government stability is the first and most important aspect here. Clearly, government stability has to do with political institutions and party system, and in particular, a critical distinction is between governments that are supported by a coalition of parties or governments that are supported by a single majority in the party system in parliament. And we all understand that coalition governments tend to be very bad at making intertemporal decisions for a number of reasons, because they are more unstable, so they have a shorter term horizon. also because government bargaining implies that the future costs and the future benefits of these decisions are not fully internalized. They will be shared within the coalition in the future, and this leads to typically to myopic decisions. And the key decision, the key determinant of whether you're going to have a coalition or a single majority government is typically the electoral system. PR elections have more fractionalized political party systems and more frequent coalition governments. The second determinant of the intertemporal incentives of political decision makers is, of course, the proximity of elections. And so the relevant time horizon is determined by the distance from elections. One interesting remark, if you look at the evidence, is that across democracies, legislatures have pretty much the same duration. The striking difference between democracies is really in the duration of governments, not of the legislature. So I would regard the first item in this slide, government stability, as the main component when you think about international comparisons of how effective different governments are in making intertemporal decisions. One other important conceptual category in thinking about policies towards productivity is the distinction between policies that provide benefits to all, like public goods, versus policies that provide benefits to a targeted and selected group of beneficiaries. Clearly, policies that are good for productivity tend to be policies that provide benefits for all, like general public goods. And clearly, in a democracy, these kinds of public goods tend to be underprovided because you don't need to please everybody to win the election. You just need to please a minimum winning coalition. So this suggests that if you can win the election or build consensus with a smaller minimum winning coalition, then the incentives to provide public goods will be reduced. So here, thinking about what determines the size of the needed minimum winning coalition, the electoral system is one component of those determinants. And here, PR elections come out as favorable because they force governments to build broader coalitions of voters and groups. And so typically, PR elections have stronger incentives for public good provision compared to instead a majoritarian electoral system. One other important aspect that relates to the allocation of inputs across firms and sectors, but also more generally other determinants of productivity growth, is the ability of the political system to enact efficiency enhancing reforms and to change the status quo when the status quo is inefficient. So the question here is when thinking about the political failures in bringing about efficiency enhancing reforms is what determines status quo bias and the ability to enact these reforms. So clearly the answer to this broad question has to do with the strength of political lobbies in defending the status quo or pushing for aspects of the reform that reduce its effectiveness. And so you have to think about which interest groups are organized as a lobby. And the answer here is different, probably, depending on whether you think about labor market reforms or product market reforms. When thinking about labor market reforms, typically the lobby that defends status quo may be inefficient are trade unions. when you think about product market reforms, the lobby instead is more on the capital side and the producer side. So the literature on lobbying suggests that in general, you may want to have lobbies fighting each other. So it's not necessarily the case that having more lobbies is worse. In a situation in which one lobby is active, it may be actually better to have other countervailing powers. And so if the labor market is organized by powerful unions, there may be benefits in having a countervailing lobby amongst the organizations of employers, if you think about labor market reforms, but vice versa, if you think about product market reforms, you welcome the lobbying power of the unions. One interesting question that touches upon the discussion that we heard before is whether centralized or decentralized decision-making is better placed to overcome the activities of lobbies. And the answer here is ambiguous. It depends on whether the lobbies are better able to lobby at the local level or at the central level. So think about the European Union versus member states. Some lobbies are more active inside each member state. Others are more active in Brussels. And you have to ask whether these different activities of lobbies are complementary or substitutes, whether they are countervailing powers that tend to offset each other or not. So the literature that has studied this question of whether a government is more easily captured by lobbies at the national or local or European level has answered that this depends on the nature of the policy. If the policy creates opposite interests at a higher level, then you may be better off in moving the decision at the higher level, because there the lobbies are more likely to be fighting each other and have less influence on national policy, on policy decisions. So I think that this is an aspect that matters for institution design, and in particular for thinking what level of government should be in charge of which policy to overcome these lobbying aspects. A second dimension that relates to this question is the number of veto players inside government. Of course, a coalition government has more veto players, so will typically be less able to change the status quo. And similarly, institutional checks and balances that would be more typical of parliamentary democracies may have more status quo bias if they increase the number of veto players. Of course, there is a trade-off when thinking about the design of institutions that affect the number of veto players. Reducing the numbers of checks and balances and concentrating power facilitates reforms, but on the one hand, it increases the risk of abuse. On the other hand, it also increases the scope for policy uncertainty. We understand that policy uncertainty is a drag on private investment, and one benefit of a status quo bias and of checks and balances is that it reduces policy uncertainty. Think about the US. If the US had the parliamentary system like that of many European countries, maybe Trump would not have been elected, or it would have been much less powerful than he was. And if Italy had a presidential system, maybe we would have had Salvini in government. And so the policy uncertainty associated with extreme politicians would, of course, be much more damaging. One last question that has been studied in the literature concerning reforms is whether reforms are easier or more difficult in good or bad economic times. I think the answer here is ambiguous, both in theory and a priori, sorry, both in theory and in the evidence. In theory, you may argue that in bad times, the cost of unsustainable status quo is higher, so the incentive to reform is higher, and also public opinion is more attentive to the reform, it's more aware of the need of reforms, and so this would suggest that bad economic situations tend to be good instances for implementing a reform. On the other hand, in bad times, you have fewer resources available for compensating the losers, and that may push in the opposite direction. And the evidence that I have seen on this question is ambiguous. Turning to private organizations as opposed to political failures, of course, private organizations differ in many dimensions. And the research on these issues has shown that management practices are a key determinant of organizational efficiency. And in particular, decentralized organizations are better able to grow, to overcome the difficulties and of making decisions in a very centralized environment. So in order to facilitate firm growth, you need to be able to enact decentralized structures with a separation of management from shareholders. And existing research has also shown that this is more likely to happen in cultural environments in which there is more generalized trust and more civic capital. And generalized trust is associated with the notion of a universalistic value system that does not only apply moral notions and value systems to friends and relatives, but to abstract individuals at large. So cultural systems that are more universalistic tend to have more generalized trust, and in these environments, it's more likely to see the flourishing of large organizations with decentralized structures. Of course, other aspects that relate to culture are the extent to which we welcome meritocracy as opposed to favoritism of friends and relatives. And these cultural aspects also matter for the quality of government and the quality of the public administrations. They matter in the selection of politicians, and they matter in the extent to which voters can hold politicians accountable. So there is a lot of evidence that in environments where civic culture is more lacking and defective, politicians can get away with more corruption and more abuses because voters are less willing to punish the politicians that abused of their trust. So institutions are one component of the quality of government, and institutional checks and balances in particular are one component of how you can fight corruption and abuse of power. But there is a complementarity between well-functioning institutions that discipline corruption and a culture that encourages civic participation and universalistic values. You can better exploit the institutional checks and balances when you have a more civic culture. One last question that you may ask about the politics and the productivity growth has to do with the big distinction between democracy and autocracy. Of course, this question is highly relevant for China, where we are seeing a transition from growth by imitation to growth by innovation. And a natural question is whether this growth by innovation can be sustained in a regime that remains an autocracy. And a priori, we understand that it may be more difficult to sustain innovation in a more autocratic society, because it's going to be there is going to be less open thinking and less opportunities for innovations that may be disturbing the autocratic regime. We don't have a lot of evidence on this. We have historical evidence. So people have studied the determinants of innovation and the clusters of innovations and creativity in historical periods. And this research has shown that the European cities that became clusters of creativity in the distant past were communes. They were free cities with autonomy and with elements of representative democracy. Of course, they were very oligarchic environments, but they were more democratic environments compared, and more open compared to the cities that were less creative. And this literature has shown that the mechanisms that led these free cities to be more likely to emerge as creative clusters were several. One aspect was their ability to attract political refugees and religious refugees from other nearby places. A second was the protection not only of property rights, but also of personal freedom and basic rights. And the third was the fragmentation of political power. So a more fragmented political power could direct resources and commission resources to a variety of projects, a variety of individuals, and this was more likely then to lead to successful innovation. So an ingredient that was instrumental to innovation in the past was to have an integrated competitive system that where cities competed with each other with fragmentation of political power. So the combination of political fragmentation with economic integration in a single market created a competitive environment that facilitated innovation. So summarizing, many policies hinge on productivity growth, and productivity growth is the outcome of very complex interactions. Some of the factors that I mentioned always have a positive direct or indirect effect on productivity growth through the policies they encourage. And this is a civic culture and universalistic values that lead to better organizations and better functioning political systems, an open and competitive political environment, and a selection of good politicians. Other aspects of institutions entail trade-offs. Electoral systems are one aspect that entails trade-off. A majoritarian electoral system brings about government stability and governments that are sustained by single party majority, and hence they are more effective. But a PR system leads to stronger incentives to build broader coalition and to provide public goods. And likewise, checks and balances have pros and cons because they may make a decisions process more rigid, but at the same time, they avoid political uncertainty and prevent abuse. So let me stop here and allow time for discussion. Thank you.
Guido, that was really, really interesting, and so many points to pick up on. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm now delighted to invite Anton Muscatelli to respond. Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli is the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Glasgow. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and an academician in the Learned Societies of the Social Sciences. Between 2017 and 2020, he chaired the Russell Group of research-intensive universities in the UK. Anton has also been a consultant to the World Bank and to the European Commission, and between 2007 and 2009, he was an advisor to the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee on Monetary Policy. Anton, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us, and we look forward to your comment on Guido's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian, and it's a real pleasure. Indeed, it's a real privilege to be a discussant on Guido's very stimulating presentation. Guido, in a very short presentation, has actually presented us with a real tour de force, because in a handful of slides, he touches on much of the literature which he himself has contributed to, drawing not only on the literature on how political institutions and indeed constitutional norms on collective decision-making impact on economic outcomes such as productivity. But he then, towards the end, he takes us into the terrain of the burgeoning literature on culture and institutions, which he and other authors like Thorsten Persson and Alberto Bicin and many others have contributed to. So I'm not as qualified to obviously comment on the technical detail of Guido's presentation. Instead, what I'm going to try and do is perhaps to try and relate this to the work of the research program of the Productivity Institute and where we might gain some insights. And I'm going to really sort of make 4 points. The first is a rather overarching and perhaps a rather trivial point, but I think it is important. I think Guido's presentation highlights the importance of the Productivity Institute having 8 research programs. And just to remember what Bart said earlier, I mean, these are wide ranging. They touch on human capital, institutions and governance, and of course, the current discussion very much relates to that, but also to geography and place and social, environmental and technological transitions. And as Guido says in his presentation, productivity growth is really the outcome of very complex interactions. And really, the only way to analyze it, I think, is through very different lenses. And when the Institute was put together, it was agreed that to understand better and enable improvements in UK productivity, it should really take different disciplinary approaches. And even in terms of economics, as both Bart and our research director, Tony Venables, have pointed out, the aim in the Institute is actually to bring experts from a wide range of social sciences and STEM subjects together as well. And I think Guido's presentation shows the wisdom of that approach. So that's just an overarching point. But perhaps a second and more significant point is that the political economics of productivity tells us something about the limits of simply looking at macro type relationships. For instance, cross-country comparisons, panel, cross-country analysis, panel data, because things get, or even simple correlations between macroeconomic variables and indicators on political institutions, or indeed other variables like culture. And actually, a number of authors have pointed out, Guido himself in his work with Thorsten Persson, that actually it's quite difficult to do this empirical analysis to capture causal links. Indeed, as well known from their work, it's actually quite difficult to estimate causal effects. They did some Guido and Thorsten Persson did some very sterling work in their book on the economic effects of constitutions, but it's really difficult to develop a very robust strategy which identified causal effects. And once it actually gets much more complicated because of the kind of factors that Guido was referring to in the later part of his presentation. Because once you start putting in culture and other factors into the equation, everything becomes even more complicated. And I mean, Guido's own work, again with Thorsten Persson in the Handbook of Historical Economics, I think highlights some of the issues, as do the theoretical models which were developed by Alberto Bicin and Thierry Verdier in their NBER papers. You get some very complicated dynamics, direct and indirect effects and interactions between culture and institutions. And it can be complex, partly because institutions evolve more slowly than policy decisions, and in turn, culture evolves even more slowly than that. And of course, many on the call today will be familiar with the work by Asimoglu and Robinson and others who've tended to focus on case studies and looking at particular historical periods. But it really does become very difficult once you have all these variables in play. So, what does it mean for the likes of the Productivity Institute? Once you start having models in which culture institutions are endogenous and jointly determined, I think actually it makes some sense to look at more structural analysis, to look at natural experiments, or indeed to look at events analyses where institutions suddenly change because of sudden events, and then understand the structural factors at play. And this is where deep dives at the sectoral level can be really helpful. One of the early papers from the Institute, from the Productivity Institute, is actually a paper by Diane Coyle and some co-authors in Cambridge, and Diane's on the call today. And what they do is they use qualitative evidence to look at, they use semi-structured interviews to understand both the short run and the potential long run effects on health output and productivity following the COVID shock in two major NHS England hospitals. And if you look at the outcome of their research, it actually speaks to how organizational culture is impacted by that shock, but with constraints. When previous policy decisions around health service capacity and indeed incentive structures within the NHS in England were actually important predetermined or state variables. And I think economists sometimes tend to shy away from qualitative analysis of this type, but actually it's really interesting if you look at individual events and how they impact on organizations to understand what is happening around organizational culture when some of the policy variables are actually fixed around that point. My third point is that if we focus on particular events, there are some really interesting insights that might come from the political economics approach outlined by Guido. Indeed, in some instances, as Guido and Torsten Persson note, institutions can overcome their natural inertia and change very rapidly. And Brexit is a case in point. It was a very sudden, it was a very unpredictable shock to political institutions in the UK, where we left not only the political institutions of the EU, but actually we also decided very quickly to leave the single market. And this, of course, has consequent impacts on trade, inward migration, and hence productivity. It's a really good example of a very sudden change in institutions. And actually, when you look back and you look at the economic trigger for this event, now there may be various causes, but one trigger might have been the experience of UK productivity since the global financial crisis. Prior to 2008, the UK labour productivity growth wasn't the most rapid in the OECD, but it did increase steadily. This allowed improvements in living standards, including median real wages, average household incomes. But after 2008, there was a real stagnation in the UK compared to many other OECD countries in productivity and indeed in living standards. And combined with a very constrained fiscal policy, it's likely to have been a driver of the Brexit referendum vote. Now, Guido and together with some co-authors of Bocconi actually have looked at how prospect theory can explain why voters who suffer income or consumption losses actually are attracted by the riskiness of risky policy propositions such as Brexit. And so it's actually really an interesting example of this feedback loop between productivity and indeed other institutions and other variables. So you end up having a negative self-reinforcing dynamic. And for us, I mean, the problem in policy terms in the UK, what happens next as we move beyond Brexit is how we reverse that negative dynamic, creating a more positive dynamic on productivity through those institutional and cultural channels. And obviously that's one of the key key areas of interest and key questions for the Institute. So for me, the question is what policy reforms can trigger a more positive dynamic in institutions and both business, organizational, but also cultural effect, but also societal cultural effects as a new starting point for the UK. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment, because my final point really concerns that whole issue of geography and place, which we've already touched on this afternoon. It's one of the Institute's research programs, but it's also one of the key issues confronting the UK when it looks to deal with the productivity challenge. The UK government has recognised this because it's now post-Brexit focusing on a levelling up agenda. And this is really, again, a response to the political forces, the regional, indeed intra-regional divides that we've already referred to, which drove Brexit. And really, it's partly of a drive to try and create a more unifying dynamic in the country. Now, if one looks at sectoral and regional levels of productivity in the UK, actually the UK's productivity growth slowdown post-2008 was very broadly based across regions and sectors, not least because of the financial crisis effect on the productivity of the financial sector, which impacted actually largely on London and the southeast. So actually all UK regions and nations have seen a productivity slowdown relative to pre-financial crisis positions. But of course, there were major initial differences in UK productivity levels at both the regional level and, as I say, within regions between different types of companies and different types of sector. And many of these differences are probably multifactorial. Tim Besley referred to these were driven by differences in education and skills, R&D intensity, availability of regional finance, management, organizational practice, and the propensity to export, to just mention a few. So the key question again is how you create that positive policy dynamic across the regions and nations in the UK. In countries like Italy and some regions of Europe, and Guido's analyzed this, some of those differences are around civic culture and historical differences. Guido mentioned between municipalities and regions in Italy, for instance. Anecdotally, in the UK, this seems to be less of a driving force for regional heterogeneity. Indeed, I think there are some interesting questions as to whether the nature of economic development in the UK, such as the preeminence of sectors like financial services, have driven centripetal and agglomeration forces in skilled labor and investment, which have ended up influencing our economic geography. So I think it's really interesting to consider whether a political economics approach could help us address whether you need simply changes in regional policy. So it's about public spending on the different regions, improving infrastructure differentially, the regional distribution of public R&D spending, for example. Is that enough? Or do you actually need changes in institutions? For instance, more regional devolution, as has been mentioned, creating political agency at local level, strengthening regional finance institutions. Now, the problem here, as Tim Besley mentioned, there's a trade-off, because on the one hand, you create more fragmentation. You create political agency at a local level, but you create more fragmentation as well. And then there's an issue around coordination. For instance, with the setting up of the UK Infrastructure Bank, as has been said, the devolved nations are doing very similar things. So how do you coordinate this effort? And then Guido mentioned another factor, which is around lobbying and lobbying at a local and national level. So that could create other political distortions. So I think there's some really big questions here for the institutes. Does the UK need stronger checks and balances in terms of devolution between the English regions and the devolved nations and central government to try and change some of our economic geography? Or is it, is that going to make matters worse in terms of coordination and we lose some of those coordination economies? Or will, centrally determined changes in the pattern of public spending do the trick? Or indeed, actually looking to another shock, if you're looking at a kind of an event analysis, looking at the next big shock, which is the technological transition towards net zero, to which the UK is, of course, committed, as well as many, the devolved nations in different ways. What does that mean for productivity and living standards across some very different economic geographies? So, these are some of the, I think, open questions which I think a political economics approach might help us to address. And again, I think it's an area where I believe that disciplines such as political science and sociology and anthropology can actually be very helpful to the Institute's work. I'm just going to leave you with one quotation just to at the end, just before I conclude. I was actually, when I was thinking about this, I thought back to Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And in that, he warns us that he warns us against interpreting, and I quote, particular features of a historic process that impress the analysts, in this case, the economists in the room, which tend to, and I quote again, slip into fundamental causes when they, whether they have a claim to that role or not. And I think we have to be very humble in the Institute in using economic models which seek to identify fundamental forces in economic development. I do think a multidisciplinary approach actually in our diverse research programs will allow us to keep questioning ourselves as to whether we really are picking up on fundamental causes or not. Thank you, Adrian. I think I'll stop there.
Anton, thank you so much. That was really fascinating and touched on some really fundamental questions around cross-disciplinary study, but also, you know, fewer institutions, more policies, or better policy coordination as part of institutional reform. Some really, really good questions. We were going to break between sessions 1 and 2 roundabout now. I'm loath to cutting off the discussion, so I want to bring Guido back in. We'll see whether there's time to pick up on any questions that we have also received from the participants, and thank you again for those. Guido, do you want to respond to some of the points that Anton has made? And then we'll see how much time we've got left, but we'll certainly have a 5 or 10 minute break before the next session for everyone to stretch their legs and get some coffee before we carry on. So Guido, over to you.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Anton has said. I would like to stress one point, which I think is very important everywhere in the current circumstances, and that is the point that he mentioned on the self-reinforcing dynamics between productivity and political outcomes. So I have spoken mostly of the political determinants of productivity growth, but as Anton emphasized, a stagnant productivity environment will have feedback effects. And these feedback effects we have seen at work in advanced democracies now, and they are behind the growth of populist support in many democracies, and I imagine of the Brexit decision in the UK. There is evidence that populist governments are very bad for economic efficiency. And there are interesting papers that have looked at populist governments in Latin America, for instance. So the outcome there is clear. There is also convincing evidence that support for populism is indeed driven by the fact that there are some places and some groups that are systematically left behind by economic progress. So technological innovation, globalization are forces that have pushed for economic efficiency and have improved the productivity growth throughout, but they have done so very selectively in some areas and not in others. And so the scope of agglomeration economies has increased enormously because of globalization and because of technology. And so there are areas and social groups that are clear losers. And that's what behind these populist movements. So I think an important message that Anton emphasized implicitly, if not explicitly, is that we should not only think about aggregate productivity growth, we should think about how to compensate the losers from the reforms and the factors that drive productivity growth. And that may open up new policy challenges, because the traditional way of thinking of how to compensate the losers has been through welfare systems and the transfers to individuals. But if indeed agglomeration economies are so important and the losers are geographically concentrated, maybe these welfare policies are not necessarily the right tool. And maybe we should think about place-based policies to compensate the losers, because the losers tend to be geographically concentrated. And that may be not necessarily the most efficient thing to do, but it may be the right thing to do to avoid the political feedback that Anton correctly emphasized. So I just want to stress this point.
Thank you, Guido, very much indeed. That point about, I think, efficiency versus, what is the right thing to do for people who are directly affected by the effect of globalization, technology, and so on, I think is a really, really important one, especially when it's linked to place. And I think geography is something we're going to hear more about throughout this workshop, and indeed the lifetime of the Productivity Institute. We did promise everyone a break, and I want to make sure that we honor that. So we will now break for coffee. We will keep, of course, a record of the questions, and we will bring those in the other sessions. We do have a roundtable at the end of today's workshop, so there'll be another opportunity there to respond to some of them. After the break, we'll have a presentation by Stephanie Ricker from the LSE. My colleague Andy Westwood, who co-leads the governance and institutions theme of the Productivity Institute with me, will chair. A huge thanks to him for everything he's done for this workshop and for the research of the theme. Let's now have a roughly 8 or 10 minute break and come back just after 4 o'clock UK time. Thank you again to Guido Tavolini for a fantastic presentation, to Anton for his response, to all of you for your questions. See you in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
Hi, Andrew. Good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. It's very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, virtually.
I've just ordered your book.
Oh, thank you.
No, it looks great. I'm sorry, I didn't sort of spot it before, but
Oh no, it just recently came out in paperback, so it's good you waited. The hardbacks are so expensive; it's ridiculous. So
it looks great. I'm really looking forward to
Thank
getting
you.
it, and I'm
Thanks,
very much
Andrew.
looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you.
It's been quite good fun so far.
It has, yes. No, it's a very interesting conversation.
And after all of this, it'd be good to actually have a conversation about what we're doing in the theme, and and what you think of where we're doing stuff, and maybe if there's a way you can get kind of more involved in it.
I'd like that. Thanks. That'd be great.
Cool. Excellent. Well, I think we're going to give people a few more minutes, and then giving Adrian a little rest. Although he is your discussant.
Well deserved.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Right.
I heard that, Andy.
Yeah. What? A little rest.
Very good. Yes, no, it's been terrific. I find myself
really good.
Fantastic range of arguments. So all good. Yeah, very nice to meet you, Stephanie.
Nice to meet you virtually.
We'll do that properly in person with Andy when he comes down to London. He's much closer to London than his institution affiliation would have us believe.
I can see it from my window.
Big smoke. That's right. Very good.
Stephanie, have you checked your slides?
No.
Functioning?
Shall I do it?
You
I'll do it
want
now.
to quickly do that just so that
Oh, somebody else is sharing. I'll wait.
Somebody else is sharing.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, though. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's see.
That all looks pretty good to me.
Great. Perfect. I'll stop sharing for now, okay?
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Just thought it'd be useful to
Yeah.
reassure everybody. Well,
Thank you.
me and you mainly.
Thanks.
Cool, thanks. Okay, I think it's time for us to resume with session 2. And just to introduce myself, I'm Andy Westwood, and as Adrian's already said, I'm co-leading the institutions and governance theme with Adrian, and I'm also giving him a very brief break from presenting and chairing the proceedings today that so far, I have to say, has been absolutely brilliant, and I have every confidence that's going to continue. As I say, it's a very brief break for Adrian because he will be the discussant in this session. But to start us off, it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Rickard from the LSE, who is a professor of political science and whose research examines the effects of political institutions on economic policies, appears in a wide range of journals and particularly, and I gather it's just out in paperback, Stephanie's 2018 book, Spending to Win. Stephanie particularly looks at, which is fantastic for this session, particularly looks at kind of why governments selectively target economic benefits, and demonstrates that a lot of economic policy can be explained by the combination of electoral institutions and economic geography, which obviously we've already heard is a very, very strong theme of both the Institute and the discussions so far today. Stephanie's presentation is entitled The Effects of Political Institutions on Economic Policy. So very much looking forward to hear what you have to say, Stephanie, and over to you.
Great. Thanks so much for that very nice introduction, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So again, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much for having me. We've already heard a lot of interesting things. And I think what this session and what this workshop is doing is really important because we have these two connected challenges. On one hand, we want to think about what are the policies that potentially could produce productivity, or enhance economic growth. And that's a really difficult challenge. But there's a connected challenge that I argue is equally difficult, and that's thinking about the politics of it. Even if we can identify the best economic practices to promote productivity, the second and related challenge is how do we get the political will? How do we construct the political coalition to get these types of economic policies enacted, to put them in place and ensure that they stay in place long enough to actually promote productivity and to promote economic growth? And these two challenges are both difficult, but they're inherently connected and often at odds with one another, because we know that the types of policies that tend to, or we think will likely produce productivity, require long-run investments, long-run strategies, long-run planning. But politics is really a short-term game. Politics, political parties are typically looking ahead to the next election and thinking, what can I do to get reelected? What can I do to stay in office, to keep my party in office? So there's almost this inherent tension that is very difficult to resolve. The long-term nature of some of these productivity enhancing policies, but the short-term nature of politics. So how could we potentially start to untangle or resolve this contradiction? One place that we might look are institutions. So institutions are the rules of the game. They shape how politics and policy are made. And there's two sets of institutions that really impact on government policy, public policy, and economic policy. One of these sets of institutions has a really direct effect. These are institutions or rules of the game that shape public policy making. Who gets to make policy? Who gets to implement policy? These are sort of first order institutions that have this really direct impact on public policy. But there's a second set of institutions that Guido has done a really good job as researching and helping us understand better and talking about today, which are these really fundamental political institutions. These are institutions that shape the rules of the political game. Who gets elected? How do they get elected? How do governments take power? What determines who's in government? And these institutions also have a really important impact on public policy. And they do so because they shape leaders' incentives. So these institutions lay out the rules. How do I win office? How do I get into government? Politicians and parties see the rules. They want to get into government, they want to get reelected or elected in the first place, and they're thinking about how to do that. And one way to do that is to implement certain types of economic policies. And so these types of institutions have an impact on public policy and on economic policy, but their impacts are often more indirect and harder to observe directly, harder to think through that direct causal chain of how do we get from the rules governing who wins office to public policy outcomes. There's a connection, but it's a long connection and often very complicated. And as a result, there's no single optimal set of political institutions that I can offer you today. We can't sort of backward engineer it and say, I want policy X, right? I think policy X is going to promote productivity. Tell me what institution I need to get policy X. It's no one can sit here and give you that kind of answer, in part because the connection between these institutions and public policy, it's a long connection. It's a complicated causal chain, and there are many things that impact on it. And so as a result, identical political institutions can produce very different public policies in different contexts. And so I'm going to argue that the impact of institutions on public policies really depends on the context in which they operate. And this is a point that Tim made, this is a point that Guido's made, and everybody thinks about the context slightly differently. So Tim suggested one of the contexts that might shape how institutions work are norms. Guido suggested one of the contexts that shape how institutions work, maybe culture. In my research, I'm going to suggest that one of the ways in which institutions work, or that one of the contextual factors that shape the way institutions work is economic geography. So the same institutions will produce different types of policies depending on a country's economic geography. Now, what do I mean by economic geography? Economic geography refers to the geographic distribution of economic activities like production or employment across space within countries. And so we know that some types of economic activities tend to be more geographically diffuse, whereas other types of economic activities tend to be more geographically concentrated. And this also varies across countries. So in the United Kingdom, for example, some economic activities like services tend to be more geographically diffuse. There's some concentration. So the service sector in London, for example, accounts for about 93% of output compared to 80% of the UK overall. So there is some concentration of the service sector in London, and of course, particularly the financial service sector. But in general, services tend to be more geographically diffuse. Things like hotels or restaurants, they're going to be diffuse across the country in order to service the population. But other types of economic activities like manufacturing employment tend to be far more geographically concentrated. And so here, let me just show you this map of the United Kingdom. And so here I'm showing you manufacturing employment per 100,000 economically active people by local authority districts. So this is data from 2016. And while you can see that there is a distribution of manufacturing employment, some areas have very little, almost no manufacturing employment, London in the southeast, where other areas have high concentrations of manufacturing employment, some areas in the north, for example. And so my argument is that how these types of economic activities are distributed geographically interacts with institutions to produce policy outcomes. So the exact same political institutions will generate different types of economic policies depending on economic geography. And so this is true even when we try to hold everything else constant. So of course, this is very difficult to do. But even if we think about holding other factors that might also impact on economic policy constant, we have a situation where similar institutions produce different policies because of economic geography. So I'm going to show you this graphically in a moment, but first let me just describe what I do in my research. So here in my research, I'm going to compare economic policies across countries with different institutions. And so I'm going to do that by taking countries and putting them into two groups. So I'm going to take democratic countries and I'm going to put them into one of two groups. So we have countries that look like the United Kingdom, where you have one person representing a geographically defined constituency, and that person wins office by winning a plurality of votes in that area. And in another group of countries, you have countries that look like more like Germany or Sweden or Spain, where you have multiple people representing the same geographic constituency. And people are winning office, not necessarily even sometimes by having their name on the ballot. Instead, voters are casting their vote for a party, and then the party leaders are selecting the individuals who will fill those particular seats. So these are two different types of democracies, two different sets of institutions that govern who wins office and how you win office. And then I compare economic policies across these two groups of countries and within these two groups of countries. And what I find, as I've already suggested, is that even these exact political institutions create very different political outcomes, very different policy outcomes, depending on economic geography. So here I'm showing you this graphically, and I'll talk you through this graph, but this is a result from data of over 20 years, 15 different countries. These are real results, not simulated results. So these are showing you the effects across this wide time period and different types of countries. And so here I have geographic concentration aligned along the x-axis. So lower value 0 means it's very diffuse. It looks more like service sector employment. But up here, it's much more concentrated, where you have these sectors of manufacturing concentration in select areas. And what I'm showing you here is that the exact same institution sometimes increases spending on government subsidies, but other times decreases it. And I should say that this is really the policy outcome that I'm interested in here. I'm really interested in government spending on subsidies, because subsidies are one of these policy areas that could potentially impact on economic productivity and economic growth. So we think that governments spend money on subsidies to help businesses. Sometimes that spending could potentially be productivity enhancing. We know, for example, that small and medium enterprises, particularly startups in the high-tech sector, often don't have easy access to the capital that they need to level up, to sort of grow to the next level. So government subsidies could help those types of businesses by providing lower interest loans, grants, or subsidies in that way. They could also potentially help through training, so providing training subsidies to businesses to adopt some of these productivity enhancing management techniques that there's good evidence of when they work. So government subsidies are a really important policy tool that potentially could enhance productivity or economic growth. And what I see in my research is that different countries spend very different amounts of their budget on subsidies. So I'm looking at government spending on subsidies as a percentage of total government expenditures. And some governments spend a lot of their budget on some subsidies, and some governments spend much less of their budget on subsidies. But what's interesting is that there's no average pattern. What I'm showing you here is that you see this black line at 0. When it's above that black line, I'm showing you that this particular institution, so here's, I'm focusing on these institutions like Germany, Sweden, Spain, where you have multiple people elected from a constituency, where parties are winning shares of seats in the parliament as a proportion of their national vote. That institution actually increases government spending on subsidies, but it only does so when the recipients of these subsidies are geographically diffuse. When the recipients of these subsidies are geographically concentrated, up here at the sort of higher values of concentration, this exact same institution actually reduces government spending on subsidies. So this graph is simply to illustrate that the same institution can have very different effects on the exact same type of economic policy. In some cases, increasing government spending on subsidies, in other cases, decreasing government spending on subsidies. It depends on the context in which the institution is operating, and here it depends on economic geography. So I think that this echoes a really important point that Tim made, which is you really want to beware of average institutional effects. If you just took the average here, you might find that the institution has no effect or maybe a negative average effect, but that average is obscuring a really important fact, that the institutional impact on government subsidies depends on the geographic concentration of the recipients. So I just want to echo Tim's really important point, beware of averages. If somebody says this institution on average increases economic growth or on average increases productivity, you really want to drill down and see, is that average effect masking a sort of positive effect on economic productivity in some instances, but a negative effect on economic growth or productivity or government spending on subsidies in other instances. So I think really, if I could leave you with one key take-home point, it would be that there's no simple institutional solution. It's impossible to say, if you want to achieve policy outcome X, you need to implement institution Y, because there's just no simple institutional solution. Institutions operate differently in different contexts. So rather than trying to identify the optimal institution, it might be more useful to think about desired outcomes or incentives. How could we create incentives to try to create political will or a political coalition to get the types of policies that we think might enhance productivity or economic growth? And so I'm going to suggest two. The first is to potentially help think about longer term incentives, longer term commitments to minimize some of these sharp policy changes. And the second is potentially to insulate at least some part of the economic policy process from explicitly partisan politics. Now, both of these ideas have already been suggested today, but let me just offer a few brief thoughts on each. The first is this idea of potentially thinking about ways to minimize sharp policy changes. So the UK is susceptible to these sharp policy reversals. So too is the United States, particularly when there's unified government, when the executive and the legislature are controlled by the same party. And this susceptibility is due to the political institutions. When you have a government coming into office and they can set the agenda and they can push their policy through, this is an institutional outcome. And this institutional outcome is recognized by the markets. There's good evidence that the stock market responds much more quickly to elections in systems like the United Kingdom than they do to systems in Norway and Germany, because the markets are anticipating these big policy reversals after an election in a system like the United Kingdom. Whereas in Norway, Sweden, Germany, we often see multi-party governments, multi-party coalitions. They have to negotiate with one another. The ultimate policy outcome we observe is some negotiated position amongst multiple parties. And so there's much smaller, more incremental change. As Guido suggested, this could potentially be a bad thing because often this could lead to policy paralysis. The policy change may be so slow that we actually get stuck in the status quo and it's very difficult to change. So what could we potentially think about or sort of strategize about for ways to minimize these sharp policy changes? The big institutions, the big political institutions are hard to change. Right? The UK is not going to become Sweden. These big fundamental political institutions that do matter, that shape policy outcomes, are difficult to reform. But the second set of institutions that I mentioned, these institutions that affect how policy is made, they're potentially easier to change and easier to reform. And so one change to those policymaking institutions might be to increase the number of actors with veto power over dramatic policy changes or reversals. Now, Guido already mentioned this, but if there are some checks and balances in the policymaking process itself, it may help to minimize these sharp policy changes and incentivize or at least create longer-term policymaking. The second idea is one that, again, we've talked about already, but is to insulate policy from explicitly partisan politics. So we know that sometimes the largest political benefits come from suboptimal economic policies. So we find this a lot in government subsidies, particularly when you have systems like you do in the United Kingdom, where politicians are saying to themselves, I need to win this next election. What could I do to win this next election? Well, I have a declining industry that's concentrated in my district. Wouldn't it be great to win generous government subsidies to prop up this declining industry? Now, that's politically beneficial for that politician and maybe even for her party, right? You're bringing home benefits to your constituents, but it may be economically suboptimal to spend government money on a declining industry. So one potential solution that others have offered already is to delegate authority to an independent agency. And so in Norway, for example, they've done this for subsidies. They've constructed an independent agency that's responsible for allocating subsidies to firms within sectors. Now, the government still has control. The government has control via the budget. They set the budget for subsidies for a particular sector. So the government has said, here's the total amount of money you can spend on subsidies in agriculture. Here's the total amount of subsidies you can spend on, here's the total amount of money you could spend on subsidies for manufacturing. But the independent agency then takes that budget and allocates it to firms within that sector. The agency has been given some tasks. They're tasked with supporting companies to promote their comparative advantage, to enhance innovation, and to achieve value-creating business development throughout the country. So this is similar to the idea of leveling up, right? They say, we want you to try to level up regions and help allocate subsidies in this way. So there's still a role for politics, but it minimizes some of these explicitly partisan politics and some of the rent-seeking behavior that often occurs. So I interviewed ministers in Norway, and they said to me, when a firm comes to me and asks for government assistance and asks for subsidies, it's helpful for me to be able to say, I hear you, but you need to go talk to this independent agency. It's called Innovation Norway. You need to go talk to Innovation Norway and make an economic case in order to win subsidies. But even in this example, there's still a room for politics, as I'm going to show you graphically here. So here I'm showing you along the x-axis the vote margin for the largest government party in 2005. And along the y-axis, I'm showing you subsidies per employee going to that district in 2007. And what you can see is even in a system where there's this independent agency, there's still a role for politics, where electoral districts or constituencies where the government is winning more votes are getting more subsidies. So even in a system where there's a delegation of the distribution of subsidies to an independent agency, there's still a role for politics. So I want to think about returning to this idea of these connected challenges. On one hand, first challenge, identify the policies that will promote productivity. On this second challenge, thinking about how do we create the optimal political institutions to generate the political will and the political constituency to actually enact these institutions. My big take-home point for you, though, today is that there's no single institutional solution because institutions operate differently in different contexts. And so with that, I'll leave it there. I look forward to comments and suggestions. Andrew already plugged my book, but if you want to learn more about subsidies, I really encourage you to take a look at my book. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a fantastic kind of session for us. I'm really taken, not just in our particular theme in the Productivity Institute, the institutions and governance theme, but maybe for the entire institute and its work, that the questions you started us off with. In other words, what are the policies that will enhance productivity, and how do you create the political will to do them? Essentially sums up our entire agenda, and incredibly succinctly. So thank you very much for that and for your presentation. If I could hand over back to Adrian, who is going to give us a short response, and then hopefully we'll have time to come back to you, Stephanie, and then to take some questions that I think are beginning to come into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those in the meantime. Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Andy, and let me add my thanks to Stephanie for her presentation and for those really incredibly important points. I want to start my short response with where Stephanie left off, which is her book. And if you look at the title, you might think this is just about pork barrel politics, spending to win. So just how to essentially manipulate or bribe the electorate. But actually it isn't. When you start reading it, it's a terrific read. She actually starts off with a really, really fundamental point, which is you have a choice as a government or as the governing party or coalition, which is you're either going to pursue the common good or some narrow particularistic interest. And I think that is a political choice that we should remind ourselves of all the time. Do government policies, do new initiatives serve the common good, or do they actually just satisfy some vested interest? And the reason why that's an important point is because it draws the attention to outcome and to purpose rather than just to some instrumental analysis, something that just focuses on utility in some narrow sense, even if you end up aggregating utility to get to some measure. So I think this is a really, really fundamental takeaway. And the other one is the one that Stephanie's already highlighted explicitly, which is there's no utopian blueprint, right? There is no perfect model, whether it's Norway or Finland or Germany or anywhere, or South Korea perhaps after COVID. where, you know, any country should look to and say, that's it, we'll just imitate their institutional framework and all will be well. So rather than doing that or saying, oh, well, you know, we'll tinker at the margins and get away with a little bit of incremental reform, no, you have to think through that chain from politics to policy to productivity, but you have to do so in light of norms, we've heard that already, culture, and crucially, economic geography. And of course, we could broaden that to other considerations, not only economic geography, but also geography more generally. And I think that's a second really vital argument Stephanie's work makes. And I've got two sort of questions that I'd like to sort of put to her and for the general discussion. The first one is, in the current context that the UK finds itself in, which Andy has very helpfully characterized as the ABC, the austerity, Brexit, and COVID. So 10 years of austerity, the ongoing event of Brexit, because it's clearly not just a one-off thing, it's a continuous process of coming to terms with the UK finding itself outside of the EU, single market and customs union, but then also the kind of recovery and reconstruction after COVID. How will that affect the UK's economic geography? And not just in terms of you know, individual parts of the economy, manufacturing and industry versus services, but also within those. Which of the service sectors may benefit, which will suffer, how does policy try and rectify this? But crucially also, what are the sectoral spillovers? So how will policy and how will politics affect the sectoral spillover? And I think that then raises a fundamental question for things like levelling up or state aid. Right? Because of course we now hear, well, you know, we're out of the EU, it's wonderful, we can finally use state aid in a way that we haven't been able to do for the last 40 years. Well, against that argument, of course, we'd have to look at other EU member states that have used state aid throughout their membership, are still using it, and perhaps have used it quite successfully in some cases. So again, the interesting question here would be, what explains that the UK has not made use of state aid before, right? Is it a political, ideological, set of factors, or is there something else, maybe something missing in the institutional ecology? That means that state aid has not been used so far. And then if it hasn't been used, and we understand why it hasn't been used, what would need to be done to use it effectively, not just for pork barrel politics, not just to serve sectional interests, but actually to serve shared prosperity and the wider common good. So that's one question. The other question I think that arises from Stephanie's presentation and work is about institutional reform. Is it that we should more look towards reforming existing institutions, or actually in the UK landscape think about creating some new ones? So one example here might be to say, okay, so the UK Infrastructure Bank has now been created or is being set up. Is that in and of itself really addressing a gap? Will it be, you know, sufficient to set it up, maybe to increase its capital and then see how that affects productivity going forward? Or does the UK perhaps need something like a national development bank, something that seems to be more holistic, doesn't just focus on infrastructure, but tries to link it perhaps to industrial policy in other areas, so that we don't slide back into silos, fragmented decision-making, and things not being joined up? So I suppose the two questions in short to Stephanie are, what about the effects of austerity, Brexit, and COVID on economic geography and on sectoral spillovers going forward? And in that context, state aid and levelling up, and on the other hand, institutional reform versus institutional innovation. Let me leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Adrian, and thank you for those sharply crystallised issues. Stephanie, did you want to come back on either of those, or anything that Adrian said more broadly?
I will just say two things very quickly. The effects of COVID on economic geography are fascinating, and I think this is a really important area for lots of research. We know that COVID's hitting services hard, and so that's potentially shrinking a sector that's already very geographically diffuse. But there's some suggestion, I think we don't see it in the data yet, we don't know for sure, but maybe working from home could help diffuse some of the activities, right? If people are able to work from home, they don't need to be concentrated in these knowledge sectors or these knowledge cities like London, maybe that's going to diffuse economic geography. But I think there's lots of important work to be done there. But I think that it's to be done. I don't think we know the answer yet. the question about why the UK doesn't use state aid is $1 million question, and I don't have a good answer for that. It is a real challenge. Interestingly, they also have never made use of the UK's fund, the EU's funds to help compensate the losers from globalization, like Guido was talking about, right? They have an EU fund that's set up explicitly to help people who lose their jobs from globalization, from the 2008 financial crisis, and the UK never used it. And I don't have a good answer for why. I think that we should investigate that. All of us should. Maybe somebody in the audience has a good answer. I don't, unfortunately. And finally, one thing I'd say is, institutions are politically constructed, and institutions create winners and losers. And so that getting reform is politically difficult because everybody's anticipating, right? I want an institution that's going to benefit me, right? I want reforms that are going to benefit me. So we can't kid ourselves and think that reform is politically easy, because every reform, every institution has distributional effects that create winners and losers. So my sense is that it's politically easier to create new institutions. It's still not easy. There's still winners and losers, but it's easier to create new institutions than to reform existing ones. We've seen the challenges, for example, Italy has faced to try to reform their political institutions. It's politically very difficult. So maybe new institutions is at least a politically easier challenge, but I'll leave it there so we have time for questions and more discussions. But Adrian, thanks so much. You really hit on the really key political questions that are still outstanding and need a lot more attention. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Stephanie, and I think that's an important response on kind of the political nature of institutions. I can see one question on a new institution that I'll ask in a second, but I wanted to come back to you both really on one question first, which kind of builds from that, which is that you spoke about rightly about how we might minimize the partisan nature of politics in this agenda, and equally how we might minimize what you described as the sharp policy change agenda. It occurs to me kind of thinking back to what Anton said in his remarks before the break, where he looked at Brexit as a kind of key event and how we might kind of think of that and understand not just what the drivers were, but kind of what the sort of political and institutional response is. And it struck me that kind of, when we think about partisan politics and we think about that sharp policy change agenda, in a sense, that is the point of Brexit, isn't it? Which is to create sharp political change, and to do so in a sort of a partisan way. So are we kind of fundamentally I guess misunderstanding that's exactly what politicians in this particular case, but in many cases more broadly, want to do with with their own policy agenda and their own kind of political objectives, or am I way off the mark there?
I mean, this is a really important point. And so there's almost two tensions. So one tension is the one that I started with, this tension between long run incentives and the short run incentives of politics. The second tension is between insulating economic policy making from politics and democratic accountability, right? I mean, voters, it's not just that the point of Brexit was to make big policy change. The point of elections often is to make big policy change, right? As a voter, I see a party in government. I don't like their parties. I vote. I want a different party to come into government and change those policies, right? That's part of the idea of democratic elections and democratic accountability. And so even when I'm thinking to myself about, what would I do if I could wave a magic wand and say, these are the types of institutional reforms that might generate economic policies that promote productivity, I feel squeamish myself as someone who thinks about politics and democracy, because there is this inherent trade-off. Yet insulating subsidy distribution from politics that may be economically optimal, but it's not clear that that's politically acceptable in a democratic context, because in effect you are creating or removing the policymaking process from democratic accountability. So I think you're absolutely right to point to that trade-off and suggest that there is a very delicate balancing act that we would want to think carefully about. And maybe this is where it comes back to thinking about something like the cost benefit analysis that Tim has suggested, but really not being unaware of that trade-off on democratic accountability when we're suggesting, oh, just delegate it to an independent agency. No, doing that has other types of consequences that we'd have to balance.
That's absolutely fascinating. I agree. It's when I worked in the education department, there were always lots of people asking, kind of, why can't we depoliticize education? And all the ministers said, we want to politicize education. We want to do it more. We haven't done it enough. And so you're right. You know, this trade-off, this tension is incredibly important, I think. On a specific issue of institutions and institutional change, and Adrian pointed to, you know, a government with an ambition for both reforming institutions and creating new ones. We've got a question from Nick Alton, who asks specifically about the setting up of the UK version of ARPA, or ARIA, or ARIA, depending on how you pronounce it, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. An interesting kind of departure from innovation to invention. But we're setting up a completely new funding organisation for a particular type of research. As Nick points out, it's meant to invest in high-risk projects. Assuming we agree that that's a good idea, how should it be governed and assessed? Who wants to have a go at that one first? Stephanie, he's your colleague at the LSE. Why don't you start?
Okay, I mean, that's a really hard question and a good question. I would maybe start with the first principle question. I mean, do we think that this is the right activity for government to be involved with? Is this some area of market failure where we think government intervention and money could be used efficiently? And I think that in this particular case, it's a good example of where experts are going to be the key involvement here. So, you know, I mean, Tim alluded to this in his presentation. This might be really a role for experts to come in, and apolitical experts, right? To just say, like, these are the experts, this is what they think is going to work. And they're not stepping outside their lane, right? These are experts that think this is the type of investment we need, this is where it's going to pay off the most. So staying in their lane, using their expertise, and insulating it again somewhat from politics to ensure that we're getting value for taxpayer dollar in that type of investment.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, Adrian, any thoughts from you on how we should establish, govern, and assess the effectiveness of ARIA as it's just being set up?
I'm not sure really. I wanted to make another point, but it may well relate to this question, which I thought was an excellent one from Nick. And I suppose it's the question of the distinction between insulating decision-making from partisan politics and insulating it from all democratic accountability. And what I have in mind is an independent agency or institution that nevertheless reports to Parliament and is accountable to Parliament, and therefore where there is democratic accountability without necessarily, you know, being subject to partisan politics. If we think that government tend to rule based on partisan calculations. You know, it seems to me that I think elements of the Norway model are interesting here, because if I'm not mistaken, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, or the way that that's run, I think, is I think through accountability to the Norwegian Parliament, as opposed to being simply subject to whatever government wants to do, because I think there are very strict limits on how they can spend money and how much, etc. So I wonder whether we might want to draw that distinction and what that might mean for certain institutions if they were set up. But I think on the agency, I think there's this question that has been raised before, which is how does it relate to other policy initiatives? So even if you were to be in favor of such an agency, how do you link it up to, you know, other government policy so that it's not disjointed and ends up, you know, producing suboptimal outcomes? And I'm not sure whether I've seen any thinking there that suggests that it's going to be fully integrated into a new policy or institutional ecology that would make, you know, more sense in terms of joined up decision making. So yes, perhaps to an agency, if it's well intentioned, properly funded, but how does it relate to other parts of the government machine? And I think until that's clarified, I would be more skeptical of such an agency. It's a bit like saying, let's create Silicon Valley over here. Well, that's never going to happen because you don't have the institutional and other cultural and geographic determinants that created Silicon Valley in the first place. So these are sort of pointless, I think, blueprints.
Yes, I guess even though that may be one of the explicit intentions of ARIA to do precisely that, it has been set up kind of deliberately away from other organisations, free of coordination, if you like, as well as free of certain levels of scrutiny or accountability, so that it can maximise its attention to risk-taking and to operating in a different way. It reminds me really, I mean, it's almost, I guess, an anti-ref as an organisation, and we've I think a lot of us on this call will have been going through the ref quite intensely in the last few weeks. So it's almost been an organisation set up explicitly to avoid all of those activities or requirements, so that it can do its work, which is an interesting kind of proposition in of itself. I've got another question for you, Stephanie, from Scott Hurrell, who asks about the implications for subsidy of modern monetary theory, and do the assumptions that underpin modern monetary theory, does it kind of remove the risk from making politically expedient decisions? I assume because you can just spend on anything. But what do you think?
Okay, that's a good question. That's an excellent question. I'm going to take Tim's advice though and stay in my lane and say I'm not an economist. But no, I mean, when governments are spending on subsidies, so I interviewed a lot of ministers and bureaucrats and politicians about subsidies. They were very cognizant of budgetary trade-offs, right? And I think that is, in practice, that's a hard trade-off to remove in their mind. So, I mean, I had ministers literally say to me, if I spend a subsidy on this, I won't be able to spend it on nurses or help. One of the ministers in Sweden said, I will not subsidize the automaker Saab. I'm not going to provide them with subsidies because voters want me to spend that money on nurses and daycare and schools and teachers. So even if we think that trade-off might not bind as hard as it does, I think it's going to be a hard sell to convince politicians and bureaucrats and ministers of that. And the sense is that even if they're very interested in providing subsidies, there is this sense, just because of the mechanics of budget making, whatever I allocate to this sector, to this industry, to this subsidy, it's coming from somewhere else. Nobody's just inflating their entire sort of spending on subsidies. And this is why the Norwegian example, I think, is very clever. The government has specifically said, here's the money you can spend on agriculture. Here's the money you can spend on manufacturing. That's it. That's the budget. That's a hard budget constraint that then the experts or the independent autonomous agencies have to work within. And so it concentrates the mind, and they're responsible for then using that money in the best way to diversify the economy, to diversify economic activities across the country, to ensure that the startups that need it most get the money. And interestingly, when I interviewed the people that worked at the agency, they said to me, if we had our way, we would move all of the subsidies from agriculture into manufacturing. They said, we need to get out of subsidizing agriculture. This is not a productive use of taxpayer dollars. We would move it all into manufacturing so that we can fund these high-tech sort of startup companies that we think are our best chance to diversify, to grow the economy, to promote productivity. But they were politically constrained. They couldn't do that. So that was sort of a political decision that was still in the hands of the government. the experts believed it wasn't economically optimal, but it was almost a compromise, right? Exactly on the trade-off that we were talking about. There was still room for politics, right? Politics were still involved. The government was still able to guide policymaking in a way that appeased some important constituencies, like the agriculture sector for the sort of agriculture parties that were in government. But there was this real pressure to use the money wisely because there was a hard budget constraint. So yeah, so I'll leave it there.
That's great, Stephanie. I mean, even in modern monetary theory, there are constraints and trade-offs eventually, whether they're political or budgetary. So no, I think I'm sure you're absolutely right. We're at time, so it's time to kind of hand back to Adrian as the chair of the next session. But just before I do, I want to thank you, Stephanie, for your presentation and your answering of those questions and just kind of that whole dimension you've brought on kind of, you know, the reality of politics into our thinking today. So thank you very much. And
thanks for having me. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for your comments, Adrian. And now back to you to chair the final session.
Andy, thank you so much for that. And I'm only really chairing this because you're part of the next session, and therefore it seemed better to take back the chair. But thank you so much. I'm delighted now to be joined for the roundtable discussion that concludes today's event by 4 close colleagues from the Productivity Institute. Let me introduce them briefly, and then Diane will kick us off with her presentation. So the first panelist is Diane Coyle, who's the inaugural Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, where she co-directs the Bennett Institute. She was previously Professor of Economics at the University of Manchester, and she's also held a number of public services roles, including Vice Chair of the BBC Trust, member of the Competition Commission and the Natural Capital Committee. As part of TPI, she leads the Knowledge Capital theme, so one of the 8 research themes. The second panelist is Jagjit Chadha, who's the director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. He's held academic appointments at St Andrews, Cambridge and Kent, and also acted as an academic advisor to the Treasury, to the House of Commons, Treasury Select Committee and other policy making institutions outside the UK. As part of the Productivity Institute, Jagjit leads the macroeconomic theme, and he's also the chair of the Productivity Commission, about which more will be announced shortly. The third panelist is Tony Venables. Tony is Professor of Economics at the University of Manchester and was previously Professor of Economics at Oxford and also Chief Economist at the UK Department for International Development. He is the Research Director of the whole of the Productivity Institute. And the fourth member of the panel is Andy Westwood. I haven't introduced him until now. I should have done it right at the beginning, but I've kept the best to the last. Andy is Professor of Government Practice at the University of Manchester and also acts as a special advisor to the Select Committees on Economic Affairs and Digital Skills in the House of Lords. He is the co-lead of the Governance and Institutions theme of the Productivity Institute. That, if I may say so, ladies and gentlemen, is your panel. And it's a wonderful lineup. And may I hand over to Diane to kick us off. Diane, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Adrian, and afternoon, everybody. So this is not my theme, and because the theme that I'm leading is called Knowledge Capital, then it's the case that everything looks to me like ideas, that productivity is all about ideas. And that means both the scientific discovery that we often think about when we talk about innovation or technological progress, but also processes like the Kanban board shown here, the products, the gadgets like the smartphone, the business models like the prepay SIM card that was an innovation from South Africa originally, and also consumer acceptance. So we're talking about ideas from end to end across the whole economy. And as we know from endogenous growth theory, from Roma and Stiglitz, and even back to Arrow, if you're including ideas production, then markets are going to underproduce ideas, is one conclusion. But also we're talking about multiple possible growth trajectories. multiple equilibria. And that means that productivity problems are really all coordination problems, and that's where the political economy comes in. When you're talking about coordination across a whole economy, be it national or subnational, that's not easy because there's a lot of people to get together and align and agree about things. But when it works, it can be very successful. And so in development economics, we talk about growth miracles, that the countries that do manage to get themselves from one trajectory to another, that can be very dramatic. There are examples at the level of cities as well, cities that reinvent themselves after they have experienced deindustrialization. So they can be dramatic. We often think about policy interventions in terms of market failures. And people often talk about the market failures and the government failures as being, in a sense, opposite to each other. But to my mind, they occur in the same kind of places for the same kind of reasons. They are both about how hard it is to get these coordinations working in the context of incomplete markets, asymmetric information, all of the other failures of the first welfare theorem that we economists are very familiar with. So you can identify an arena of market failure for an intervention. That's also going to be an arena of government failure, and the policy is really hard. And this means that politics and institutions are absolutely fundamental, and we can't fix the economics of productivity without fixing the politics in that broadest sense of how are we making collective action possible and successful. So it seems to me you can take two approaches to this. One is to investigate the parts. And if we think about it in the context of the UK, there are some parts that we know very well don't work all that well. One is the interface between research and business. A lot of research is done in universities, and there seems to be a gap in how we translate that basic research and invention into innovation and commercialization. So that's a known problem. There are problems that we know about inside organizations of all kinds in all of the sectors. And so I've just flagged up here a couple of pieces of work that I've done already under the Productivity Institute umbrella. One on healthcare, which Anton mentioned, looking at the institutional structures within the health service and how the crisis unglued the decision-making barriers, but they may be gluing back up again as the crisis ebbs. Also questions about how to use technology in healthcare. So for example, you can do more video consultations. That is going to require some evaluation of patient outcomes. Are they actually as good? It suits the doctors and the medical staff to do video consultations. Does it lead to as good patient outcomes? Questions about the digital divide. Who's going to pay for all those devices that we would need for that to happen? And then just yesterday, we published a policy brief looking at the gig economy and the way that the passing of risk out to all of the workers who are on these platforms actually reduces their capacity and incentive to invest either in human capital or physical capital, and has created a low productivity segment of the economy, which actually, when you try to assemble all the different bits of data, is probably about a quarter of the UK workforce. So you can look in at the parts, and I can't remember what I meant by writing social aspects here, but I'm sure there are some social aspects of that too. Or you can investigate the whole, and that I think is where there are some really interesting questions. So questions about how do you get coordination between government, different levels of government agencies, be they independent of political decision makers or not. This is something where we used to think until about a week ago that Germany was acing it in the pandemic, and now that's not so clear. So this is very context dependent between countries and probably over time as well. Questions about the philosophy of state action. I think the UK has been unusually adherent to free market philosophy over, well, all of the years since the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. Should we now be thinking more about procurement and market guarantees? They've worked so well for vaccines. Can they work just as well in the green and digital transitions? Do we think it's strategic enough about standard setting? It's very clear that the Chinese government has over 20 years made sure that it's occupying key roles in the International Telecommunications Union, and will have quite a grip on future standards in these domains of standard setting. We have a good role in broadcasting standards because the BBC has done that. That was a kind of unintentional strategic view about standard setting. And then I think there are really interesting questions about the gap between the market and the state. If they are two kinds of collective institutions for decision making, there are others too. Looking back to the Industrial Revolution, we saw a great deal of institutional innovation in that space, unions, mutuals, and so on. Are there things that we need to be thinking about and the barriers to setting them up? One example that comes to my mind is the whole open data movement, where a lot of local initiatives are creating from the bottom up some data infrastructure that will enable innovation and new businesses. Then finally, and that's the picture here, I had to get a Union Jack in the presentation, obviously, because I think it's compulsory now, but the idea of government narratives, political narratives, as coordination devices, setting people's expectations. And so in all of these, I think there's a fantastic research agenda for us in the Productivity Institute. And I want to end finally by stepping outside my own area, out of my lane, just to pontificate or reflect about some specific UK dysfunctions. So far today, we've heard Guido saying that coalitions have shorter time horizons than myopic, and Stephanie saying that first past the post systems give you these sharp policy reversals. The map in the top left, it's the red countries that are first past the post countries. And so that's actually a minority. Thinking about that seems to me a very interesting question, because we do seem to have a really particular problem with policy reversals in areas where businesses are having to make decades-long investment decisions, such as how electricity markets operate. Then there's the Westminster model, all the territorial aspects of that, not having a constitution, and this idea that Parliament is sovereign in everything, and the dysfunctions that seem to come with that. And then finally, Eton, we've got Etonians in government who ignore further education, and that kind of class conflict aspect of UK politics that many people have commented on. So it seems to me a really fruitful, exciting research agenda. And if the politics aren't feasible, then the economic analysis got it wrong. You know, it's a failure if we're going to say we know the right thing to do, if only the government would do it. And there are always going to be conflicts of interest. So thinking about collective decision making, which is politics, is how those conflicts of interest have to get resolved. That's it from me. Thank you.
Diane, thank you ever so much. That's a really fascinating way of getting us started for the roundtable. I think that's, you know, it's a fundamental point, because politics is all about, or should be all about, reconciling rival interests. And if it's not that, then it's not clear how it can contribute to productivity growth, shared prosperity, and the common good. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to turn to Jagjit now for some reflections on what Diane said, or some of the presentations earlier today, and indeed any points about institutions and policy in our context of productivity. So Jagjit.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you very much for asking me along today, and also Andrew as well for arranging such a wonderful afternoon. It's a very nice way to start Easter weekend, I think, thinking about some of these deep problems and sitting at the feet of people who've been working in this area for such a long time. I come from a very different academic background, and it's great to sort of think about the power of institutions. So I was thinking throughout the day about the kind of institutions in Britain that have worked, the ones that haven't, and the ones that sit in between. And then moving on from there, I tried to think about what factors we might think about in understanding which ones have worked and which ones haven't. And I want to sort of move on to a criticism of politics. Sort of being an economist, an academic economist, one who works on monetary economics and monetary theory, I hear a lot of criticism of economics all the time, particularly at the Institute. But I want to use the few minutes I've had to also sort of lob some grenades in the direction of our politicians and our politics, which I think are very much at the heart of the problems that we face. My main message is, where's been the consistency of policy in the post-war period towards, I'm having some trouble with my bandwidth, so I'm going to stop my video for a second to see if that helps. Where has been the consistency of political direction towards this target of increased productivity and prosperity across the board, whether it's physical in terms of the number of widgets we produce per person employed, or the kinds of ideas Dan are talking about, which I think are ultimately more important, which is those of the mind, how we get our ideas working and functioning in a framework and across firms and across society. And I think the question really should be thrown back at what we might call the old Etonians, but we might also call our political elite and establishment, which I think has let us down very, very badly, much more so than the economists. Let's look at the good institutions. The Monetary Policy Committee, which Tim talked about earlier on from his own experience. My experience was much more involved in helping some of those people come to decisions when I was involved in it. The Low Pay Commission. Today is the day that the national living wage has gone up. That's a good thing. The Low Pay Commission has clearly performed an admirable job in raising the living standards of poorer people and fostering higher levels of employment than might have otherwise been the case over time, and encouraging firms to invest in their employees in a way they might not well otherwise have done. Another institute that works well, the National Audit Office, written some excellent reports criticising government. The most recent on the track and trace diet, well, I can only call it complete mess up, really, of how that was done and run in the last year. National Audit Office, independent, and wrote a very clear report about the problems of it. It wasn't picked up as widely as it should have been. The Office for Budget Responsibility, set up nearly 11 years ago, has, I think, forced us to think more carefully, collectively, about the options available to fiscal policy. I think some of the fiscal rules don't make any sense at all, but that's not the fault of the Office of Budget Responsibility. It has an obligation to provide independent forecasts and has done its job very well in that period. Bad institutes, we kind of cast our mind back, those who are old enough, our collective memory, the Department of Economic Affairs, didn't last very long in the 1960s. Its idea was very much to get long-term economic planning into the system. That didn't last very long. If you remember, after the end of the ERM crisis, the Treasury set up a panel of economic forecasters, the so-called wise men. I very much hope it wouldn't be just wise men if we set up a thing like that today. And that also, I don't think, lasted very long or had any great traction on policy. Gordon Brown set up a National Economic Council based on a US model that lasted about 4 weeks, I think. And we've had the Industrial Strategy Council, which I know people on this call today have been involved in, but I also think has failed for whatever reason we might want to talk about later on. But I'll come on to that in a minute. And I think there's a particular reason for its failure that has been missed by most people recently. If we think about somewhere in between, the Treasury committees, the parliamentary committees were a very good innovation in thinking the 80s. But I think over time, they've become, particularly the ones in the Commons, dominated by party factionalism, rather than thinking hard about the issues and bringing politicians to account for the decisions that they make. There is a severe absence of accountability for politicians. I'm seeing that across the board, whether it's in Parliament or in the media, or the unwillingness of politicians to be accountable to a media that is, by and large, actually quite friendly towards politicians in this country. That seems to me to be a problem. So what might help us distinguish good from bad institutions? Let me offer some points that I've picked up today. Expertise. We need these institutes to purvey and sustain expertise that is, in some sense, of course, there's always dispute and dissent on the research frontier, but it should be understood that these are experts trying to understand complex and difficult issues using the best methods that are available to them. That, over time, will build up a locus for that institute to have some influence on policy. Its convening power is incredibly important. When we think of the MPC or the LPC or the OBR, that's an incredibly important thing that comes as well from that. I think relatedly is the sustained need to build up its reputation, which comes from its expertise, but the continuing power it has over successive waves and cohorts of politicians, I think is very important. The Institute itself needs checks and balances, need to know what it's doing well and when it has done something wrong. It needs to be open to the fact it may have made mistakes. very good example from our perspective, the OBR, is the over prediction of productivity for a decade or so. So that needs to be thought, why did we get that wrong? What does that mean in terms of how we need to be thinking about policy? It's nothing to be embarrassed about or shy about. The fact there is uncertainty about things that are not known yet is, I'm afraid, a human state of nature, is not something we should be scared about. And I think sometimes there's not enough recognition of the fact we're going to be wrong. I generally, when I help launch the Institute's quarterly forecasts, are very clear that I expect to be wrong. And the real fun is not actually when you're right, it's when you're wrong and trying to understand what bits of news, what bits of information, what structural shocks led to the errors that you've seen. And that allows you to draw a narrative as to what you want to do next. Let's not be fooled into thinking being right all the time is a helpful thing. And clearly we need objectives for these independent institutes. The obvious objective for the MPC is hitting its inflation target. The obvious objective for the Local Aid Commission is to help the living standards of the poor. The obvious objective of the National Audit Office is to pick up the government when it makes a complete, forgive the language, balls up of its spending plans. And that's a good thing in a democracy. And how do we need that then to have traction? Go back to a point that Tim made earlier on. We need media traction. We need to build up relations with the media so these points are picked up, even in a media that is by and large, I think, far too friendly towards the government. And in the end, I'm afraid we need good and better politicians. Let me go back. Let's go back in time. Not only do we have a lack of continuity in our two-party system between the choices of the left and the choices of the right, we don't even have continuity within the parties. What elements of Labour Party policy do you think the current leader would pursue compared to the previous leader? That's just one canard I can put to you. The very reason the Industrial Strategy Council, at least one of them, that it was abandoned the day after the budget, is that our current Conservative Prime Minister didn't want to pursue a policy that had been implemented by our previous Conservative Prime Minister. It seems to me the difference between one nation Toryism and levelling up through Industrial Strategy Council is paper or wafer thin to me. And I don't know why one politician from the same party can't continue with policies of the other. But we can go back in time as well. Which policies of Blair would Gordon Brown have wanted to pursue? There seems to me time and time again, and we can look at the coalition, and I would certainly recommend the Jeremy Hayward book written by his wife Suzanne on some of the vicissitudes of the coalition, on how even within there it was very difficult to see policies through. There were the adoptions of all kinds of productivity panels there on the public sector or otherwise that didn't actually last very long. So what we need somewhere in the middle of all of this is some consistency. And this was where I thought the civil service was involved in ensuring some consistency in policy over time. And I'll leave you one final thought. The productivity puzzle for the UK is not something that's developed in the last few years. I was, and I'm sorry to say, I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, which tells you how old I was. It was something I was lectured to then. There's been a productivity puzzle, shortfall, chronic failure for the whole of my life and before of it in the UK. So we have to think very hard about solutions that also are involved in the long run way that we run our country and our economy. And I'm afraid that does make me think that our political institutions and perhaps our educational institutions are as much at fault as anyone else. And certainly it's not the economists. I'm going to see if I turn my camera on right now, but I've got the most awful broadband connection, for which I apologize. I did try to get it heated up today, but it hasn't worked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jagjit. And it is perhaps the case that while economists faced somewhat of a backlash, a wave of criticism after the financial crash some 12 years ago, perhaps it is the turn of political scientists and indeed people in politics more widely in light of recent events that they didn't really anticipate. And that probably goes back to Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and indeed the way that there has been a response or lack of response to some of the challenges thrown up by COVID. But as you say, the productivity problem that the UK has goes back decades and surely needs therefore a profound rethink. not so much to put up a defense of politics or political scientists, but because I would love to hear from him, I'd like to turn to Andy now.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Diane and Jagjit for kicking us off. It's more than a little intimidating to follow both of you, even more so when I think I might have to rise to Jagjit's challenge and in some way defend the role and credibility of politics and even to some extent politicians, which I shall try in the first half of my comments. In the second half, I think I shall probably agree with you. But let me start really by, and this actually does build a lot on the fantastic contributions from Tim and Guido and Anton and Stephanie as well. But I want to start with kind of where Diane kicked us off and her introduction around kind of this being all about ideas. And in a sense, what we've heard throughout the afternoon is that productivity and policy about productivity has to happen within the kind of context of politics. It has to appreciate what creates political will. It has to kind of have a deep and this obviously relates to the entire work of the Productivity Institute and its time frame. And it needs to understand political ideas too. And I think, of course, politicians and policymakers have ideas about productivity too. And at a very base level, these are legitimate things to do and to think. So, they have ideas about economic geography, which has been a strong theme today, about cities, about towns. They have ideas about firms and people and how they behave rationally or irrationally. And they have ideas about institutions at a supranational level, at national level, and at local and regional levels too, all of which we've touched on in different discussions and presentations this afternoon. And there's no doubt, I think, without getting into detail or judging the detail, there's no doubt that kind of, we have a government that has an ambitious agenda of change in lots of those areas. It has lots of ideas in those areas, and part of those ideas are to reform, as Adrian challenges us earlier, to reform existing institutions, in a hard-edged way, whether that's the civil service or the NHS or the BBC, but it also has an agenda to create new institutions. And we've had a discussion in response to a question about ARIA, the new Advanced Research Agency. And we've had a long discussion in various points about the Industrial Strategy Council and essentially its replacement with the Building Back Better Council. So I think, I think part of my comment is that, of course, politics matters and political science matters, and are seeking to understand the tensions and trade-offs between exactly the kind of things that Jagjit has just referred to, but also so many of the issues that all of our speakers have referred to today. But I think, and this takes me back to one of the questions I threw back at Stephanie unfairly, so I apologise for that. Is that kind of that question about those ideas sometimes prioritising that sharp policy change, that sharp political change? And if you look back at some of the kind of key electoral moments in 1997, in 2010, and as Jagjit points out, even in 2019, where we went from one Conservative government to another, the agenda institutionally and in terms of ideas, did absolutely prioritise, I think, that sharp policy change. This is a juncture. This is a critical juncture that we're deliberately creating in order to enact the kinds of changes that we think are needed, either to change different aspects of society or public service, or to address the functioning of the economy, and in particular, as Jagjit has pointed out, particular aspects of productivity. And where I agree wholeheartedly with Jagjit and with others is the level of churn that this inevitably provides us with, and this is a fundamental principle or a fundamental issue that I think will sit so centrally to the work that we will be doing in this theme, but also across all of the interests and themes of the Productivity Institute. And you know, we can look at the level and degree of churn in lots of areas. I'm constantly reminded of the Institute for Government's study that they did in 2017 called All Change, where they identified 3 areas that had, in their view, had witnessed the most significant and damaging change over the last 3 decades. And they were, in no particular order, regional policy, industrial policy, and skills. Three areas that I've spent most of my career on in government and have been guilty of some of those churns and changes along the way. But in a sense, you know, what that report did was kind of highlight just how much of a problem churn is. And although we've mentioned the Industrial Strategy Council and its abolition on a few occasions today, the industrial strategy is since 2017 is another chapter to add to that critique. I could, even since its abolition at the budget and the launch of the Plan for Growth that essentially replaces the industrial strategy created in 2017, I could also point to the churn in the description of the new Plan for Growth along the way, because I think we are on more or less the sort of 4th or 5th description of kind of how that change has been brought about. It started off as a rebooting or a refreshing of the industrial strategy, then a scrapping, and now it is building on the best aspects of the industrial strategy and taking forward its best elements. So we've even seen at a very micro level in the political discourse, the political justification for that change, a churn in the way that that in itself is described. So I guess I will finish there, but really, you know, those remarks are really designed to kind of agree with so much of what we've heard today about how important the political context is, and to return to Stephanie's kind of original question, you know, how do we create the political will to enact the policy changes that we believe will make a difference to productivity, and kind of acknowledging that, you know, that lies absolutely at the heart and centrally of what we must seek to do in our work, not just in this theme that we're discussing today, but in the Productivity Institute as a whole. And I'll stop there.
Andy, thank you very much. And I think you've really summarized the task ahead for us, which is to produce independent, impartial analysis and evidence-based policy ideas, and then see how, together with others, we can, you know, help create, or at least create conditions that are conducive for that policy change, the political will that will be required to adopt and implement those policies that will be developed across the work of the TPI. That really is, I think, the moment at which to bring in Tony, who as research director will always keep an very watchful eye over everything that goes on and will help us tease out those policy ideas. So Tony, for some reflections, over to you, please.
Great, thank you. And obviously, let me start by thanking all the participants and everyone who's been online listening for a great afternoon. What I want to do is just rather briefly try and tie together a few of the threads that we've heard. Well, not really tie them together, but link them perhaps, and bring them back to productivity, to the productivity puzzle as I see it. I suppose, yeah, when I think of the sort of overarching market failure, yeah, my hypothesis about the overarching market failure that creates the UK productivity puzzle, it's really something of underinvestment due to investors not being able to capture the full benefits of their investments, of their actions. Essentially, there are spillovers, linkages. We make an investment, we perform an action, but we don't capture all the benefits. Therefore, we underinvest. Obviously, we see that in R&D ideas, as Diane has mentioned. We see it in skills repeatedly, both individual investments, but also investments by firms underinvesting. We see it in the public sector in aggregate, but also in fragmentation in the public sector. If there are these linkages, how on earth can you appraise a railway line without thinking through its effects on housing and location and other things? So we're just not taking in the full set of potential benefits from as we take investment decisions. And certainly that at the firm level, firms invest, probably create some consumer surplus in so doing. They may change wages, they may create spillovers, they may have Keynesian demand effects, they may create agglomeration economies, lots of benefits, lots of spillovers that aren't being captured. Okay, so my hypothesis is that's the underlying market failure. I suppose two questions follow from that, well, at least two. Well, one is, well, is that particular to the UK? Well, not particular to it, but maybe somewhat because of a prevalence of an ideology that all coordination is done through markets. Everything is valued through markets, and things that don't go through markets, perhaps we as a society have ignored more than other societies. But then the question is, of course, if this is a problem, then the policy challenge is to create institutions, business environment, where more of these spillovers get internalized. In my mind, that's the way to raise investment and address the underlying problem. Okay, this is hard to do. Hard to do for a lot of reasons, and most of the reasons have been touched upon at various points during the discussion in the afternoon. It's hard, technically it's difficult to do. I mean, I can sit here and talk about spillovers, but what do we know about them? Can we quantify them? Where are they? They're not absolutely everywhere. We know very well what they are in some contexts. Electric vehicles, you clearly have to coordinate all the different stages from batteries to charge points to clearly a coordination problem that the market alone will have a hard time solving. I suppose we know how to do it in vaccine R&D and production now. We did, somewhat surprisingly, actually manage to coordinate a set of decisions through a lot of different actors. But in general, it's hard to do technically, and particularly hard to do where we think it's transformative change. So really all you can do is map out possible scenarios, and then the unimaginable happens. Canary Wharf actually succeeds. High Speed 2 might, you never know. So particularly difficult with transformative change. But if we were to address it through institutions, then I suppose where I'm heading here is it's not about creating new institutions, it's about joining up existing institutions. If we're trying to coordinate things, then it's about joining up, having people take this wider view of their actions. That too is hard to do. I mean, within government, it's obviously hard. Even if nominally you've got exactly all government departments kind of have the same objective. Obviously, they all have limited bandwidth, and they all have their own motivations and incentives. So it's hard to do. Perhaps devolution helps. It sort of narrows down the focus a little bit. You're focusing on a smaller geographical area, maybe a smaller set of issues. So perhaps less fragmentation in devolved government, but then of course less coordination across governments, across regions. So it's hard to do within government. It's particularly hard to do across firms, because obviously on the whole we want firms to be in a strongly competitive relationship with each other, but they are in complementary relationships sometimes through R&D spillovers, building skills in a local labor market, lobbying for local infrastructure, having influence through a chamber of commerce. above all, I think, in value chains, where clearly they want to bargain. They've got opposing interests on the one hand, but an ultimate shared goal in making the whole value chain work. But thinking about institutions that can achieve that right balance of coordination and competition, I think really hard. And perhaps institutions, it's the wrong word. I mean, I think Diane probably said it better, talking about mechanisms, advanced purchase agreements, market guarantees. I mean, some of the things that maybe made the vaccination program work. But anyway, the real sort of challenge of sets of issues there. Also hard, of course, because there are gainers and losers, be it in a negotiation in a value chain, or certainly in the spatial context. And I think Tim referred to, if one place gets the railway line or gets the cluster, another place doesn't. So with gainers and losers, well, it's all very well for us to talk about potential Pareto improvements, but if policy is going to deliver changes that are not actual Pareto improvements, there will be winners and losers. So it's hard. Okay, well, that's sort of framing some of the issues as I see them in very general terms. But again, as Tim really emphasized at the beginning, we need to think these things through context by context. General terms are far too general. So many contexts where we need to think through what it's going to take to raise that level of investment and thereby raise productivity. So that is the challenge that faces the Institute, and we're looking forward to it. Adrian, back to you.
Tony, thank you so much. That was really a wonderfully concise summary of many of the themes that we've heard about this afternoon. We're nearly at 5:30, and I'm keen to conclude on time. You've all been incredibly patient. You've all been incredibly generous with your time and your ideas. So let me just say a few words of thanks. First of all, and not at all in the least, to the team who've helped us put this event on. So huge thanks to Chloe and to Luke and to everyone behind the scenes for making this possible. It's really been wonderful, and it has been recorded, so it's there for everyone to listen to and engage with at the end. And please do engage with the whole work of the Productivity Institute over the coming weeks and months and indeed years. My second thanks go to all the participants who've joined us this afternoon. It's been a great response, some fantastic questions, and we really value that engagement with you very, very much. And do please keep in touch and don't hesitate to email us, and we will try and respond to some of the questions that we couldn't address here this afternoon. And my final thanks, of course, to all of the wonderful speakers, to Tim, to Guido, to Anton, to Stephanie, to Diane, to Jagjit, to Tony, and to Andy. And I think I speak on Bart and my behalf when I say that you've given us so much food for thought, so many ideas. And thank God it's a long weekend that we can actually now sit back and reflect on this and also relax a bit. So have a very good Easter. Thank you again very much indeed, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.